I'll never forget the sound of my family's laughter fading into the night as they drove away, leaving 8-year-old me shivering alone at a deserted gas station. My father didn't even look back. My mother stayed silent. And my little sister, she just giggled from the back seat like it was all a game. I stood there in the freezing cold, clutching a torn backpack, waiting for them to come back. They never did. Fast forward 20 years. I clawed my way out of that nightmare, got adopted by people who actually loved me, and built a television empire worth $60 million. I became the face that millions of women trusted, a symbol of resilience, grace, and second chances. I thought I'd buried that gas station memory forever. Then they showed up at my mansion gate, my biological parents, my sister, holding cheap flowers and wearing rehearsed smiles. They didn't come to apologize. They came with lawyers, lawsuits, and one audacious demand: give us half of everything you've earned or we'll destroy you. They went on national TV crying about how their ungrateful daughter abandoned them. They faked photos. They manipulated the media. They turned my own audience against me. But here's what they didn't know: I had evidence they never expected. Security footage they thought was long gone, legal documents they tried to bury, and witnesses who remembered exactly what kind of people they really were. So I decided to give them exactly what they deserved. What happened next in that courtroom shocked everyone, including me. And by the end, the whole world would know the truth about the family who threw me away like trash. Stay with me, because this story has twists you won't see coming, and an ending that will leave you speechless. My name is Dana Knight. I'm 38 years old, and for the past decade, I've been the host of one of America's most beloved daytime television shows. Millions of women tune in every week to hear me talk about resilience, second chances, and finding strength in the darkest moments. What most of them don't know is that every word I speak comes from a place of unimaginable pain, a night that changed my life forever when I was just 8 years old. I can still feel the cold. It's strange how certain memories burn themselves into your bones, becoming part of you in ways that never fade, no matter how much time passes. That night at the gas station, the wind cutting through my thin jacket, the smell of gasoline and dust, the flickering lights casting shadows that made everything feel like a nightmare. I couldn't wake up from. It's as vivid today as it was 20 years ago. I remember standing there, my small hands clutching the torn backpack my father had thrown at my feet. The fabric was ripped at the corner, and I kept running my fingers over the frayed edges, needing something to hold on to as I watched the taillights of our car grow smaller and smaller until they disappeared completely into the darkness. My mind couldn't process what was happening. This had to be a mistake. They were coming back. They had to come back. But they didn't. The highway stretched out in both directions, empty and endless. The gas station behind me was closed, its windows dark and covered in grime. One of the pumps was broken, leaning at an angle like it had given up trying to stand straight. The fluorescent lights above buzzed and flickered, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that made the shadows seem alive and threatening. I kept telling myself they'd realize they forgot me. They'd turn around any second now. My father would pull back into the lot, annoyed but not angry, and my mother would open the door and tell me to get in. My sister would complain about having to make room for me again, but I wouldn't care. I'd squeeze into that back seat and never complain about anything ever again if they'd just come back. But even as I tried to convince myself, a terrible certainty was settling into my chest like ice water. This wasn't like the other times they'd threatened to leave me behind when I didn't move fast enough, or when I cried too much, or when I asked for things we couldn't afford. This felt different. This felt final. Then I heard it. Faint at first, barely audible over the wind and the buzzing lights, but unmistakable. Laughter. My father's harsh, mocking laugh, the sound that always came before something bad happened. And underneath it, quieter but still there, my little sister's giggle, high-pitched and oblivious the way children laugh when they don't understand the cruelty they're part of. My mother's voice was absent. She never laughed. She never spoke up. She just looked away like she always did. The sounds faded with the roar of the engine swallowed by distance and darkness. And that's when I knew with absolute certainty they weren't coming back. This wasn't a threat or a lesson. This was abandonment. Real, deliberate abandonment. I tried to understand why. What had I done that was so terrible? They had to leave me here. I thought back through the day, searching for the moment I'd crossed some invisible line. Had I been too slow packing my things? Had I asked for food when I shouldn't have? Had I cried when my father yelled at me that morning? But the truth, the one I was too young to fully comprehend then, was that it didn't matter what I'd done. Nothing I could have done differently would have changed this outcome. I wasn't left behind because I misbehaved. I was left behind because to them, I was a problem that needed to be solved, a burden that needed to be removed. The wind picked up, and I pulled my jacket tighter around my body, even though it did almost nothing to keep out the cold. My teeth started chattering. I looked around the empty lot, trying to decide what to do. Should I start walking? But which direction? The highway was dark in both directions, and I had no idea where we'd been going or where we'd come from. Should I stay here and wait? But wait for what? For them to change their minds. For someone else to find me. The broken gas pump creaked in the wind, and somewhere in the distance I heard what might have been a coyote. Fear wrapped around me tighter than the cold. I was 8 years old alone in the dark, and I had no idea what to do. That's when I saw the headlights. At first I thought maybe it was them. Maybe they had come back after all. Hope surged through me so suddenly and so powerfully that I almost ran toward the approaching car. But something made me hesitate. The headlights were moving slowly, cautiously, not with the angry speed my father always drove. This was someone else. The car pulled into the lot and stopped several feet away from me, as if the driver was being careful not to frighten me. The engine cut off, and for a moment, everything was silent except for the buzzing lights and my own ragged breathing. Then the door opened and an elderly man stepped out. He was tall but stooped with age, wearing a heavy coat and a worn baseball cap. His face, illuminated by the flickering station lights, was creased with concern and something that looked like disbelief, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. He took a few slow steps toward me, his hands visible and non-threatening, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle and filled with a kindness I hadn't heard in so long I'd almost forgotten what it sounded like. "Sweetheart," he said softly, his eyes scanning my face and taking in my thin jacket, my torn backpack, my shivering frame. "How long have you been out here alone?" I don't remember exactly what I said to him. The words came out broken and jumbled, something about my family leaving and not knowing where they went. Mr. Hawkins, that's what he told me his name was, didn't pepper me with questions the way adults usually did. He just nodded slowly, his weathered face growing more troubled with each word I managed to get out. "Let's get you warm first," he said. And before I could react, he was taking off his heavy jacket and draping it around my shoulders. It smelled like coffee and cedar, and it was so big on me that the sleeves hung past my hands. The warmth was immediate and overwhelming, and I realized just how badly I'd been shaking. He guided me gently to his car, opening the passenger door and helping me inside. The heater was still running, and warm air rushed over me as I settled into the seat. He handed me a thermos of what turned out to be hot chocolate. He said he always kept some with him on cold nights, and I wrapped both hands around it, feeling the heat seep into my frozen fingers. Mr. Hawkins sat in the driver's seat, but didn't start the engine. Instead, he pulled out an old flip phone and stared at it for a moment, seeming to wrestle with a decision. Then he dialed, and I heard it ring twice before someone answered. "Tommy," he said, his voice urgent but controlled. "I need you and Margaret to come to the old gas station on Route 9, right now." There was a pause, and I could hear a muffled voice on the other end asking questions. "There's a little girl here who needs help. She's been left alone, and I don't think—" He glanced at me, then lowered his voice slightly, though I could still hear every word. "I don't think this was an accident, son. Please come now." Whatever the person on the other end said must have been agreement because Mr. Hawkins nodded and said, "Thank you, we'll wait here." He hung up and turned to me with a reassuring smile. "My grandson and his wife are good people. The best people I know. They're going to help us figure this out." I wanted to ask what there was to figure out. My family had left me. That was the only thing that mattered. But I was too tired and too scared to form the words, so I just sipped the hot chocolate and tried not to cry again. True to Mr. Hawkins' word, a car pulled into the gas station lot less than 30 minutes later. A man and woman got out, both moving quickly but not frantically. The man was tall and lean with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. The woman beside him had gentle features and dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, and there was something about the way she carried herself purposeful but warm that made me feel slightly less terrified. Mr. Hawkins got out to meet them, and I watched through the car window as he spoke to them in low tones, gesturing occasionally in my direction. The woman Margaret, I would soon learn, kept glancing at me, and each time she did, her expression grew more pained. Then she walked over to the car and opened my door, kneeling down so she was at my eye level. She didn't reach for me or crowd my space. She just looked at me with eyes that seemed to see everything: the fear, the confusion, the bone-deep exhaustion. "Hi, sweetheart," she said softly. "My name is Margaret, and this is my husband Thomas. We're here to help you, okay? You're safe now." I didn't believe her. How could I be safe when my own family had thrown me away? But there was something in her voice, something steady and true that made me want to believe her. Thomas approached more slowly, observing me carefully. I noticed the way his gaze took in my too thin frame, the bruises on my arms that I'd tried to hide, the way I flinched when he moved his hand to adjust his glasses. He exchanged a look with Margaret, and I saw understanding pass between them. These weren't people who would miss the signs. These were people who knew exactly what they were looking at. "We should take her to the police station," Thomas said quietly to Mr. Hawkins. "They'll need to file a report and search for her family." The police station was bright and overwhelming after the darkness of the gas station. Officers moved around us with purposeful efficiency, asking questions, making phone calls, typing information into computers. Margaret stayed beside me the entire time, a steady presence that kept me from completely falling apart. Thomas spoke with the officers, providing details about where and when his grandfather had found me. I watched as they searched databases for missing child reports. One officer made call after call to nearby precincts, asking if anyone had reported a missing 8-year-old girl. Each time the answer was the same. No reports, no frantic parents calling in, no one looking for me at all. Hours passed. The officers' expressions shifted from routine concern to something darker: confusion mixed with anger. One of them, a woman with graying hair and tired eyes, sat down across from me and said gently, "Honey, most parents call within minutes if their child goes missing. It's been over 3 hours now." That's when it really hit me. They weren't looking for me. They weren't going to look for me. I had been erased, discarded, forgotten as easily as throwing away trash. The sob that tore out of me surprised everyone, including myself. Margaret immediately wrapped her arms around me, and this time I didn't pull away. I buried my face against her shoulder and let everything pour out, all the fear and pain and devastating realization that I had never been wanted, never been loved, never been anything more than a burden to the people who were supposed to protect me. "They said I'm the problem," I whispered through my tears, the words my father had repeated so many times that I'd started to believe them. "They said I cost too much." I felt Margaret's entire body go rigid, and when I dared to look up at her face, I saw something fierce blazing in her eyes. Not anger at me, anger for me. She pulled back just enough to look me in the eyes, and I saw her make some kind of decision right there in that moment. As a social worker began processing paperwork and discussing temporary placement options, Margaret leaned close to me and asked in a voice so gentle it made my heart ache, "Would you like to stay with us for a little while?" I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. That night, I slept on the Marshall's couch wrapped in blankets that smelled like lavender, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt something that wasn't fear. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls and meetings. Social workers came and went, asking questions I struggled to answer. Margaret never left my side during those conversations, and Thomas made sure I had food, water, and quiet spaces when everything became too overwhelming. But the question everyone kept asking was the same: where were my parents, and why hadn't they called? The answer came 4 days after I'd been abandoned, and it wasn't what anyone expected. When the investigators finally tracked down my biological parents, I wasn't in the room, but Margaret told me later what happened. Their reaction wasn't panic or relief that I'd been found safe. It was irritation. According to the social worker's report, my father's first words were, "She probably ran off again. That kid's always causing problems." Run off. As if an 8-year-old child could somehow be responsible for being left at a deserted gas station in the middle of the night. The social worker who handled the call told Margaret that my parents sounded rehearsed, like they'd been preparing their story for days. They claimed I was difficult, that they'd been dealing with financial stress, that raising me had become impossible. My mother barely spoke during the conversation, letting my father do most of the talking. When asked directly if they wanted their daughter back, there was a long pause before my father said, "We need to think about what's best for everyone involved." Not what was best for me. What was best for everyone. The social worker's notes described their tone as defensive and calculated, completely devoid of the fear or desperation you'd expect from parents whose child had been missing. They mentioned money problems over and over again, as if that explained everything, as if being poor gave them permission to abandon their daughter on the side of a highway. When the custody hearings began, I had to sit in a small room with bright fluorescent lights while adults talked about my future like I wasn't even there. My biological parents showed up to the first hearing, but they didn't look at me once. They sat on the opposite side of the room, my father with his arms crossed and his jaw set in that familiar expression of barely contained anger, my mother staring at her hands in her lap. Their lawyer did most of the talking, explaining that his clients were struggling financially and emotionally, that they'd been overwhelmed by the demands of parenthood, that they believed I might be better off in a different environment. I waited for them to say something that sounded like love, like regret, like they actually cared that I existed. But all I heard were excuses and complaints about how hard it had been to raise me. The judge, a woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, asked them pointed questions. How old was Dana? What grade was she in? What was her favorite subject in school? My parents stumbled over the answers, contradicting each other on basic facts about my life. My father said I was in 2nd grade. My mother corrected him and said 3rd, then seemed uncertain. Neither of them could remember my teacher's name or what school I attended. I saw the judge's expression shift from neutral to suspicious. These weren't people who'd been actively parenting a child. These were people who barely knew the child they were discussing. At one point during the proceedings, a social worker was reviewing my case file and mentioned something almost offhandedly. There was another family interested in taking her a few months ago, actually. Nice couple. But the paperwork got held up somehow. Never quite understood why it stalled out like that. No one seemed to think much of it at the time, but I saw Thomas and Margaret exchange a glance. Something about that detail bothered them, though I didn't understand why yet. As the Marshalls filed for temporary guardianship, pushing forward with their intention to keep me safe, a police officer pulled Thomas aside after one of the hearings. I watched from across the hallway as the officer showed Thomas something on his tablet, speaking in low, urgent tones. Thomas's expression grew darker with each passing moment, and when he returned to where Margaret and I were waiting, he looked shaken. That evening, after I'd gone to bed in the small guest room they'd set up for me, I heard them talking in hushed voices in the living room. I crept to the doorway and listened, knowing I shouldn't, but unable to stop myself. "They're under investigation," Thomas was saying. "Welfare fraud. They've been claiming benefits for children who don't actually live with them full-time. The officer said Dana's name was on their claim forms, but neighbors reported she was barely ever home. Margaret's response was sharp and angry. So they left her at that gas station to cover their tracks to make her disappear from their paperwork. That's what it looks like. The state was starting to ask questions, and Dana was a liability. Getting rid of her was easier than getting caught. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. I hadn't just been unwanted. I'd been a problem they needed to solve, evidence they needed to erase. The next day, Margaret sat me down and tried to explain in words. An 8-year-old could understand that sometimes people make terrible choices for terrible reasons, and none of it was my fault. But I could see in her eyes that she was holding something back, some piece of information that was too dark, too cruel to share with a child who'd already been through so much. It would be years before I learned the full truth. Years before I saw the sealed document that surfaced in my case file marked confidential, containing a witness statement that confirmed what the marshals had suspected: my abandonment hadn't been a moment of desperation or weakness. It had been calculated, planned, and executed with cold precision by a man who saw his daughter as nothing more than a financial inconvenience. The day the judge granted the marshals temporary guardianship, Margaret cried. They were quiet tears that she tried to hide by turning away, but I saw them anyway. I didn't understand then that sometimes people cry because they're happy, because they've won something precious they were afraid they might lose. I only knew that these people wanted me when no one else did, and that felt like a miracle I didn't deserve. Moving into their home felt like stepping into a world I'd only seen on television. The house wasn't large or fancy, but it was clean and warm and filled with soft light from lamps that actually worked. My room was small, but it was mine, really mine. There was a bed with a thick quilt, a dresser with drawers that opened smoothly, and curtains on the window that Margaret said I could choose to replace if I wanted different ones. The idea that I could have preferences, that my opinions mattered, was so foreign it almost hurt. That first dinner together was overwhelming. Margaret had made pot roast with vegetables and mashed potatoes, and she served it on actual plates at a table where everyone sat down together. Thomas said grace, thanking God for bringing me safely to them, and I had to blink back tears because no one had ever thanked God for my existence before. When Margaret passed me the serving dish, I took only a tiny portion, afraid of taking too much, afraid of seeming greedy. "You can have more, sweetheart," Margaret said gently. "There's plenty." But I couldn't make myself believe her. Not yet. That night, after they'd tucked me in and turned off the lights, I waited until the house was quiet before I crept out of bed and took food from the kitchen. Just small things, a few crackers, an apple, some cheese wrapped in plastic. I hid them in my dresser drawer, buried under clothes, because I needed to know I wouldn't go hungry. I needed to have something saved for when this dream ended and reality came crashing back. Margaret found my stash 2 days later when she was putting away laundry. I was terrified she'd be angry, that this would be the thing that made her realize I was too damaged, too difficult, too much trouble. But instead, she sat down on my bed and pulled me close. "Dana," she said softly, "you don't have to hide food here. I promise you will never go hungry in this house. If you're scared, you can come tell me, and we'll figure it out together. Okay?" I nodded, but it would be weeks before I stopped hoarding. Old fears don't disappear just because someone tells you they're unnecessary. They have to be proven wrong again and again until your body finally believes what your mind is starting to learn. I flinched a lot in those early days. When Thomas moved too quickly, reaching for something, when doors closed loudly, when voices were raised even in laughter. My body had learned to anticipate pain, and it took time to teach it that not all sudden movements ended in hurt. Margaret and Thomas were endlessly patient, moving slowly around me, speaking softly, giving me space and time to adjust to safety. One evening, maybe 3 weeks after I'd moved in, I finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been burning in my mind since the gas station. We were sitting in the living room, Margaret knitting, and me trying to read a book for school, when I blurted out, "Why did you help me? You don't even know me." Margaret's hands stilled, and she set down her knitting. For a long moment, she just looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then she said, Because when I was 9 years old, Dana, I stood at a train station waiting for my mother to come back. She never did. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at her, and she held my gaze steadily, letting me see the old pain that still lived in her eyes. I grew up in foster care, she continued quietly. Some homes were okay, some weren't. But no one ever fought for me the way I'm fighting for you now. No one ever looked at me and saw someone worth keeping. I spent my whole childhood wishing someone would choose me, really choose me, not just take me in because they were paid to, or because they felt obligated to. Her voice grew thick with emotion. When Thomas's grandfather called and told us about you, I knew. I knew you needed someone to fight for you. And I wanted to be that person because I understand what it feels like to believe you're not worth loving. Something broke open in my chest, some wall I'd built to protect myself from hope. Margaret understood. She wasn't just being kind or doing her duty. She knew exactly what I was feeling because she'd felt it too. Thomas found us a little while later, both of us crying, and he just smiled softly and said, "Everything okay in here?" "Everything's perfect," Margaret said, and I realized she was right. It became a routine after that, spending evenings together. Sometimes Margaret would teach me to knit or bake. Sometimes we'd watch old movies. But my favorite times were the hours I spent with Thomas in his workshop in the garage. He was an engineer who loved taking things apart to understand how they worked, and his workspace was filled with old radios, cameras, clocks, and electronic devices in various states of disassembly. I was fascinated by all of it. Thomas would show me how circuits connected, how light traveled through a camera lens, how radio waves became sound. He was patient when I asked questions, encouraging when I made mistakes, and proud when I figured something out on my own. Those evenings taught me more than technical skills. They taught me that learning was safe, that curiosity was valuable, that I was capable of understanding complex things if someone just gave me the chance to try. "You've got a good eye for this," Thomas said one night as I successfully reassembled a camera he'd been working on. "And you're good at explaining what you see. That's a rare combination." I didn't know it then, but those words would shape my entire future. The ability to see how things worked and explain them in ways others could understand would eventually become my greatest professional strength. But that night, I just felt proud that I'd done something right. Several months later, after the adoption paperwork had been finalized and I was legally their daughter, Margaret sat me down at the kitchen table with a serious expression. My heart immediately started racing because I still associated serious conversations with bad news. "There's something in your case file," she said softly, reaching across the table to hold my hand. "Something you'll need to hear when you're older." I didn't think about that conversation again for years. Life with the Marshalls became normal in the best possible way, and I learned to trust that tomorrow would come, and they'd still be there. The case file and whatever secrets it held became background noise, something that existed but didn't demand my immediate attention. I had school and friends and a family that actually showed up to my parent-teacher conferences. That was enough. But on my 16th birthday, after we'd cut the cake and opened presents, Margaret and Thomas exchanged one of their meaningful looks. The kind that said they'd discussed something extensively and come to a decision they weren't entirely comfortable with, but knew was necessary. "Dana," Thomas said carefully, "we think you're old enough now to understand some things about your past. Things we've been holding on to until you were ready." My stomach tightened immediately. Part of me wanted to say I wasn't ready, that I never wanted to be ready, that some doors should stay closed forever. But another part of me, the part that had grown stronger over 8 years, with the Marshalls, knew I needed to face this. I needed to understand exactly what I'd survived. We sat in the living room and Margaret brought out a thick manila folder I'd never seen before. My case file. She opened it slowly, handling the papers like they might shatter, and began explaining what the documents meant. Some of it I already knew from fragments of overheard conversations and court proceedings I'd been too young to fully comprehend. But other pieces were new, and each one felt like a punch to the chest. The first document Margaret showed me was a report from the State Welfare Office. It detailed an investigation into my biological father for claiming benefits for children who didn't live in the household full-time. According to the investigator's notes, my father had been receiving assistance for 4 children, but neighbors reported that at least one of those children was rarely if ever seen at the residence. That child was me. "You were one child too many," Thomas explained gently. "When the state started asking questions, your father needed to make you disappear from his records. Abandoning you was the easiest solution." I stared at the document, at the clinical language describing how I'd been a liability in someone's fraudulent scheme. Not a daughter, not a person, just a name on paperwork that needed to be erased. Margaret turned to another section of the file, this one containing reports from neighbors and anonymous tips that had been called in to Child Protective Services over the years. I read through them with growing horror. One neighbor described hearing constant screaming from the house, a man's angry voice, and a child's crying that sometimes lasted for hours. Another reported seeing a small girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, locked outside on the front porch, in the rain, shivering and calling to be let back inside. That girl had been me, though I'd blocked out most of those specific memories. But reading about them in stark, factual language brought fragments rushing back. The cold concrete of the porch under my bare feet, the way rain soaked through my clothes while I begged to come inside. My mother's face appearing briefly in the window before the curtain fell back into place. "Why didn't anyone help me?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. People had tried. These reports proved that. But my father was skilled at manipulation, at presenting a believable story, at making social workers believe that everything was fine, or that the complaints were exaggerated. "Your mother could have stopped this," Margaret said carefully, and I heard the anger she was trying to keep out of her voice. Some of these reports mention her specifically. She was there. She saw what was happening. But she never intervened, never protected you, never stood up to your father. I wanted to defend her, to find some excuse that would make her silence forgivable. Maybe she was scared. Maybe he threatened her too. But the evidence in front of me made it clear that whether she was a victim or a willing participant, the result was the same. She'd watched her daughter suffer and done nothing. Then Margaret showed me the final document, and everything else I'd read suddenly seemed like a prelude to this moment. It was a witness statement from a neighbor who'd lived next door to my biological family. The statement was brief, but the words were seared into my brain the moment I read them. The neighbor reported overhearing my father during an argument with my mother. His exact words, according to the statement, were, "She costs us more than she's worth. We'd be better off without her." The room went very quiet. Thomas and Margaret watched me carefully, ready to offer comfort if I broke down. But I felt strangely numb. This was it. This was the truth I'd been too afraid to fully acknowledge, even to myself. My father hadn't abandoned me in a moment of desperation or poverty-driven panic. He'd made a calculated decision based on a cost-benefit analysis, and I'd been found wanting. My existence had been reduced to a financial equation, and I hadn't balanced out in my favor. "I'm sorry you had to read that," Margaret said softly. "But you deserve to know the truth. Not the version they might tell someday, but the real truth documented by people who witnessed what happened." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Part of me felt vindicated. I'd always known something was deeply wrong with my biological family, and now I had proof. But another part felt hollowed out, as if reading those words had carved something essential from my chest. As Margaret began closing the file, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. One of the witness statements had a name at the top that was heavily redacted, blacked out with thick marker. But the ink had faded just slightly over the years, and I could make out a few letters. L-A-N-G something. The name tickled at the back of my mind, familiar in a way I couldn't quite place, like I'd heard it before, in a context I couldn't remember. "Who's that?" I asked, pointing to the redacted name. Margaret glanced at it and frowned slightly. "A neighbor who provided testimony. His information was sealed for his protection." "Why?" "I don't know," I said slowly. "The name just seems familiar somehow." I couldn't shake the feeling about that name, but eventually I let it go. There were more important things to focus on, like becoming the person my biological parents had said I'd never be. High school became my proving ground. I threw myself into academics with an intensity that sometimes worried Margaret and Thomas, but they understood that I needed to excel, needed to prove that I wasn't the burden my father had claimed I was. I joined the debate team, the school newspaper, and every public speaking opportunity I could find. What started as a desperate need to prove my worth gradually transformed into genuine passion. My English teacher, Mrs. Chen, was the first to notice what she called my gift for narrative. She pulled me aside after I'd written an essay about overcoming adversity, carefully vague about specifics, but emotionally raw, and said, "Dana, you have something special. You can make people feel what you've felt without overwhelming them. That's rare." I didn't believe her at first. How could anything good come from the pain I carried? But she encouraged me to enter a regional writing competition, and when I won first place, something shifted inside me. Maybe my experiences, as terrible as they'd been, could be transformed into something meaningful. Maybe I could use my voice to help others who felt as alone as I once had. The public speaking competitions came next. I'd stand on stages in front of hundreds of people talking about resilience and second chances and finding family in unexpected places, and I'd watch audience members wipe tears from their eyes. My words connected with them in ways I was only beginning to understand. The irony wasn't lost on me. The child who'd been told she was the problem, who'd been abandoned because she talked too much or needed too much or simply existed too much, was now being celebrated for her ability to communicate. At every competition, every award ceremony, every school event, Margaret and Thomas were there. They sat in the front row, cheering louder than any parent had a right to, taking pictures with cameras Thomas had taught me to use, and making sure I knew that someone was proud of me. They filled the space my biological family had left empty, and then some. The scholarships started coming in during my junior year. Academic scholarships, creative writing scholarships, awards for community service and leadership. Thomas helped me organize them all in a binder, and sometimes I'd flip through it just to remind myself that I had value, that I was going somewhere, that I was more than the sum of my worst moments. Margaret noticed my growing interest in media and journalism, and did what she always did. She found ways to nurture it. She took me to a community journalism workshop one Saturday, and I fell in love with the entire process. The way stories were constructed, the way footage could be edited to convey emotion, the power of a well-chosen word or perfectly timed pause. I started experimenting with our home video camera, creating short documentary pieces about people in our neighborhood, learning how to interview subjects in ways that made them comfortable enough to share their truths. Thomas taught me the technical aspects, lighting, sound editing software, while Margaret helped me understand the human element. How to ask questions that went beyond surface answers. How to listen, not just to words, but to what was being said beneath them. How to tell stories that honored people's experiences without exploiting their pain. By the time I graduated high school as valedictorian, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to work in television, telling stories that mattered, giving voice to people who felt invisible. I wanted to create the kind of content that would have helped 8-year-old me feel less alone in the world. College was both exhilarating and terrifying. I earned a full scholarship to study communications and journalism at a respected state university. But being away from Margaret and Thomas triggered anxieties I thought I'd moved past. The first semester was particularly hard. I had panic attacks before presentations, even though public speaking had become one of my strengths. I struggled with imposter syndrome, convinced that someone would eventually realize I didn't belong there, that I was still just the unwanted child pretending to be someone worthy. Margaret and I talked on the phone every night during those first few months. She'd remind me to breathe, to ground myself in the present, to remember how far I'd come. "Your past is part of your story, Dana," she told me during one particularly difficult night when I'd called her sobbing after a panic attack. "But it doesn't get to write your ending. You're the author now. You get to decide what comes next." Those words became my mantra. I started seeing a therapist on campus who helped me work through the trauma I'd been carrying. I learned coping mechanisms for when my father's voice echoed in my head, telling me I was worthless, that I cost too much, that I'd never amount to anything. I learned to recognize those thoughts as lies planted by someone who'd never deserved the title of father. The work was hard and painful and necessary. Some days I felt like I was making progress, and other days it felt like I was back at that gas station 8 years old and believing I deserved to be left behind. But slowly, session by session, I began to heal in ways I hadn't known were possible. My coursework reflected my growing confidence. I created documentary projects that won campus awards. I interned at the local news station, learning the fast-paced world of broadcast journalism. I wrote articles for the university paper that sparked conversations about foster care adoption and childhood trauma. I was becoming the voice I'd needed when I was younger. Senior year brought new opportunities and old fears. As I prepared my graduation speech, I knew I had to be honest about my journey without letting it define me entirely. I practiced in front of Margaret and Thomas dozens of times, refining the balance between vulnerability and strength, between acknowledging pain and celebrating resilience. The day of graduation, I stood at the podium looking out at hundreds of faces. I saw Margaret and Thomas in the third row, both crying before I'd even said a word. I talked about what it means to overcome, to transform pain into purpose, to refuse to let your worst moments become your entire story. I talked about the people who choose to love you when others walk away, and how that kind of love can literally save a life. What I didn't know was that sitting 5 rows back was a television producer named Patricia Reeves, whose company specialized in human interest programming. And as I spoke, she was already imagining what my voice could mean to a national audience. Patricia Reeves found me in the chaos after the ceremony while I was still wiping tears from my eyes and accepting congratulations from classmates whose names I'd probably forget by tomorrow. She was a striking woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an air of authority that made people instinctively step aside as she approached. "That was an extraordinary speech," she said, handing me her business card. "I'm Patricia Reeves, senior producer at Channel 7. I'd like to talk to you about an internship opportunity if you're interested." I stared at the card, my hands trembling slightly. Channel 7 was a well-respected regional station known for its human interest programming. An internship there would be a dream opportunity for any communications graduate, let alone someone who hadn't even started job hunting yet. "I'm interested," I managed to say, trying to sound professional, despite the fact that my voice was shaking. We met for coffee 2 days later, and Patricia laid out her vision. She wanted fresh voices, people who could connect with audiences on an emotional level, who understood that the best stories weren't about celebrities or scandals, but about real people navigating real struggles. She'd been watching me during my speech, she said, and she saw something rare: authenticity, combined with the ability to articulate complex emotions in ways that resonated. The internship started 2 weeks later, and I stepped into a world that was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. The television station buzzed with constant energy, producers shouting into phones, editors hunched over monitors, reporters rushing in and out with breaking news. Everyone moved with purpose and urgency, and I felt like a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes, pretending to belong in a world far beyond her experience. Margaret and Thomas drove me to my first day, both of them trying to hide their nervousness behind encouraging smiles. Before I got out of the car, Margaret grabbed my hand and said, "Remember who you are. No matter how competitive it gets, no matter what pressures you face, stay true to yourself. That's what will set you apart." I learned quickly that the television industry was full of people who would smile to your face while calculating how to use you for their own advancement. There was Rachel in promotions, who befriended me immediately, but then took credit for one of my story ideas in a production meeting. There was Mark, a reporter who offered to mentor me, but really just wanted someone to do his research and grunt work. I watched people throw colleagues under the bus for a better time slot or a chance at a bigger story. But there were genuine people, too. Patricia, for all her intensity, was fair and protective of her team. She saw through the politics and rewarded actual talent. And there was James, a veteran cameraman who took me under his wing and taught me that the best stories often happened in the moments between the official interviews when cameras were supposedly off and people let their guards down. I started in research and pre-production, but Patricia quickly moved me into story development. She'd give me raw footage or interview transcripts and ask me to find the narrative thread, the emotional core that would make viewers care. I discovered I had a talent for seeing past the surface details to the human truth underneath. The stories I shaped tended to focus on ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. A widow starting over after 50 years of marriage, a former addict rebuilding relationships with her children, a teacher in an underfunded school fighting to give his students a chance. What surprised me was how much these stories resonated with audiences, particularly older women. The ratings for segments I worked on consistently outperformed projections. Viewers wrote letters to the station saying they felt seen, understood that these stories reflected their own struggles and triumphs. Patricia started assigning me more prominent pieces, and other producers began requesting me for their projects. "You have a gift," Patricia told me after a particularly successful segment about a 70-year-old woman learning to live alone after her husband's death. "You make people feel like their stories matter. That's not something you can teach." 6 months into my internship, everything changed in a moment I couldn't have predicted. We were preparing for a live afternoon broadcast when Shelley, our regular host, suddenly collapsed in the makeup room. The paramedics determined it was a severe allergic reaction and she was rushed to the hospital. We had 15 minutes until we went live, and Patricia's face was a mask of barely controlled panic. She found me in the editing bay and said, "Dana, I need you to host right now." My immediate response was to say no, to explain that I wasn't ready, that I'd never hosted anything before, that there were a dozen other people more qualified. But Patricia was already pulling me toward the studio, talking rapidly about how I knew the content better than anyone, because I'd produced the segment, how the teleprompter would guide me through transitions, how I just needed to be myself. Before I could fully process what was happening, I was sitting on the studio couch with powder on my face and a microphone clipped to my blouse. The floor director was counting down, and then the red light on the camera blinked on, and I was live. Something strange happened in that moment. All my nervousness evaporated, replaced by a calm clarity. I looked directly into the camera and spoke the way I'd speak to Margaret or Thomas, with warmth and authenticity and genuine care for the story I was about to share. I introduced our guest, a woman who'd survived domestic violence and built a shelter for other survivors, and I asked questions that came not from the script, but from real curiosity and empathy. The 30-minute segment flew by. When we went to commercial, the studio erupted in applause. Patricia was grinning like she'd just won the lottery, and the crew was exchanging looks that said they'd witnessed something unexpected. The viewer response was immediate and overwhelming. The station's phone lines lit up with calls praising the broadcast. Social media exploded with comments about the new host and her refreshing, authentic approach. By the time I left the studio that evening, exhausted and exhilarated, Patricia pulled me aside with news that made my heart stop. "A national network just called," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "They want to meet with you, tomorrow." The meeting with the national network felt surreal. I sat in a conference room on the 32nd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, surrounded by executives in expensive suits who talked about demographics and market positioning and brand identity. They wanted to build a daytime talk show around me, something focused on resilience and real-life transformation stories. They saw a gap in the market for authentic content that spoke to women over 50, and they believed I could fill it. I signed the contract 3 weeks later, with Thomas reviewing every clause and Margaret reminding me to negotiate for creative control. The show, which we titled Second Chances, launched 6 months after that, and my life changed in ways I could never have imagined. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Women wrote to me by the thousands, sharing their own stories of survival, divorce loss, reinvention. They saw themselves in the guests I interviewed and in the compassionate way I listened to their struggles. The show's ratings climbed steadily, and within 2 years, we were the #1 daytime program in our demographic. My face appeared on billboards in major cities, on magazine covers, at grocery store checkouts, and promotional materials that seemed to be everywhere I looked. I was living a dream I'd once thought impossible. The abandoned child who'd been told she was worthless was now someone millions of people invited into their homes every day. The girl who'd believed she cost too much was now being paid more money than she'd ever imagined existed. Sometimes I'd wake up in my tastefully decorated apartment and have to remind myself that this was real, that I'd actually built this life from nothing. Thomas became my financial advisor, approaching my sudden wealth with the same careful methodology he brought to everything. He taught me about investments, diversification, and building long-term security. We created multiple income streams: the show salary book deals, speaking engagements, strategic partnerships with brands that aligned with my values. He showed me how to make my money work for me, how to ensure I'd never be vulnerable again. By my mid-30s, my net worth had climbed into the tens of millions. The financial statements Thomas showed me during our quarterly meetings listed numbers that seemed abstract, impossible. $60 million. More money than I could spend in several lifetimes. More money than my biological father could have imagined when he calculated whether I was worth keeping. But despite the wealth, I lived modestly. My apartment was nice, but not extravagant. I drove a reliable car, not a luxury vehicle. I bought quality clothes that would last, not designer labels meant to impress. Margaret and Thomas had taught me that true security came not from displaying wealth, but from managing it wisely, and I never forgot the little girl who'd hidden crackers in her dresser drawer because she didn't trust that food would be there tomorrow. I donated quietly to children's charities, particularly those focused on foster care and adoption. I funded scholarships for kids aging out of the system. I wrote checks that made real differences in real lives, and I did it anonymously because the point wasn't recognition, it was helping children who reminded me of myself. But there was one aspect of my life I kept completely private. Despite my public platform, despite the fact that my show was built on authentic storytelling, I never discussed my biological family. Interviewers would occasionally ask about my childhood, and I'd deflect with vague statements about being adopted and raised by loving parents. I'd talk about the Marshalls with genuine warmth, calling them my heroes. But I'd never explain why I'd needed heroes in the first place. The truth was too painful, too complicated, and too private. I feared that talking about the abandonment would reopen wounds I'd worked hard to heal. I worried it might make me seem damaged rather than resilient, broken rather than whole. And perhaps most significantly, I was afraid that publicly acknowledging my biological family might somehow diminish the Marshalls, might make people think of them as second-choice parents, rather than the deliberate life-saving choice they'd actually been. So I constructed a careful public image. I was poised, successful, inspirational, someone who'd overcome challenges through determination and the support of good people. I shared enough of my story to be relatable without revealing the darkest chapters. I kept my trauma locked in a box, only opening it during therapy sessions or late-night conversations with Margaret, when the old fears became too loud to ignore. Margaret and Thomas were the only people who knew everything. They'd read the case file. They'd seen me at my most broken. They understood the panic attacks that still occasionally gripped me when I felt out of control, or when someone's anger reminded me too much of my father's rage. They knew that beneath the polished television host was still a frightened 8-year-old who sometimes couldn't believe she was allowed to stay. I thought I'd successfully buried that part of my past. I thought I could keep moving forward without ever looking back at the people who'd thrown me away. I thought I was safe. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, I opened my email and saw a message from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was blank, which usually meant spam, but something made me click it anyway. The message contained only one sentence. "I remember you from the gas station. We need to talk." My hands started shaking so badly I had to set down my coffee cup. My heart pounded in my ears, and suddenly I was 8 years old again, standing in the cold, watching taillights disappear into darkness. Someone from that night had found me. Someone knew who I'd been before I became Dana Knight television host and success story. I stared at the screen, my mind racing through possibilities. Who could this be? Mr. Hawkins had passed away years ago. It couldn't be Margaret or Thomas, they'd never contact me this way. Which meant it was someone from my biological family or someone connected to them, and they'd been watching me long enough to know exactly where to find me. The past I'd tried so hard to leave behind had just walked back into my present, and I had no idea what it wanted. I spent the entire day staring at that email, my production team probably wondering why I was so distracted during our planning meeting. By evening, I'd made a decision. I needed to know who'd sent it. I forwarded the message to a tech-savvy friend who owed me a favor, and within 2 hours, he'd traced the email address back to its source. The name that appeared on my screen made my stomach drop. Jennifer Knight, my younger sister. The girl who'd giggled in the back seat while I was being abandoned had grown up, found me, and decided now, after 20 years of silence, was the time to reach out. I opened the email again and read it more carefully this time, looking for clues I'd missed in my initial panic. The message was longer than I'd first registered, explaining that our mother had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer and didn't have much time left. She wanted to see me, to make peace, to say the things she'd never had the courage to say before. The tone was carefully constructed, apologetic, but not overly emotional, urgent, but not demanding. But something about it felt wrong. The phrasing was too polished, too rehearsed, like it had been written and rewritten multiple times to achieve maximum impact. And the timing was impossible to ignore. Just 3 days earlier, Forbes had published an article about successful self-made women in media, and my name had been prominently featured along with an estimated net worth of $60 million. 20 years of silence, and then suddenly, days after my wealth becomes public knowledge, my dying mother wants reconciliation. The coincidence was too perfect, too convenient. I called Margaret immediately. She and Thomas had moved to a quiet retirement community an hour outside the city, but they were still the first people I turned to when my world felt unstable. Margaret answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar, and I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders just hearing it. "Dana, sweetheart, what's wrong?" she asked, reading the distress in my voice before I'd even said anything. I told her about the email, reading it aloud, word for word. The silence that followed was heavy and concerning. "Don't respond," Margaret finally said, her voice harder than I'd heard it in years. "Not yet. Dana, desperate families rewrite history when money is involved. They'll convince themselves they were good parents who were just struggling, that they made one mistake and deserve forgiveness. They'll erase the years of abuse and neglect and focus on one convenient narrative that makes them the victims." "But what if she really is dying?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. "What if this is my only chance to get answers, to understand why—" 20 years, Margaret interrupted gently but firmly. "They've had 20 years to reach out, to apologize, to explain. They chose silence. And now, days after the world learns how successful you've become, suddenly they want contact. That's not love, Dana. That's opportunism." Thomas got on the line, his engineering mind approaching the problem with characteristic logic. "Let's think this through systematically. What are the possible motivations? Best case, your mother genuinely wants to make amends before she dies. Worst case, this is a calculated attempt to access your wealth. Either way, you need protection, legal documentation, witnesses, clear boundaries." They were right, and I knew it. But knowledge didn't make the situation less painful. Some part of me, the part that was still 8 years old and trying to understand why she wasn't worth keeping, desperately wanted to believe that my mother had spent 20 years regretting her silence, that she'd always loved me, but been too afraid or controlled to show it. The next few days brought a deluge I wasn't prepared for. Tabloid websites and gossip blogs picked up the Forbes article sensationalizing my estimated net worth and speculating about my mysterious past. The phrase "rags to riches" appeared in multiple headlines, though none of them knew just how literal those rags had been. My inbox exploded with messages. Distant cousins I'd never heard of wanted to reconnect. People claiming to be childhood friends asked for loans to help them through hard times. Someone purporting to be my biological grandmother wrote a rambling message about family loyalty and how blood should take care of blood. Most were obvious frauds, but some felt disturbingly authentic. They referenced details about the town where I'd grown up, names of streets and schools I'd tried to forget. One message in particular made my blood run cold. Your parents want to reconnect. They've changed. They're older now, struggling, and they deserve a chance to explain. Don't you believe in second chances? Isn't that what your whole show is about? The manipulation was transparent but effective. They were using my own platform, my own message of resilience and forgiveness as a weapon against me. How could I preach about second chances to millions of viewers while refusing to give my own family one? I was still wrestling with that question sitting in my office reviewing scripts for next week's episodes when my assistant Jennifer burst through the door. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with something between fear and excitement. "Dana," she said breathlessly, "they're here, at your front gate, right now, your biological parents and a woman claiming to be your sister. Security is holding them, but they're insisting they need to see you. They say it's urgent. What do you want me to do?" The script slipped from my hands, pages scattering across my desk. 20 years of distance erased in a moment. The past I'd tried so hard to leave behind wasn't just clawing its way back. It was standing at my gate, demanding to be let in. My hands were shaking as I told Jennifer to give me 5 minutes. I needed to see them for myself. Needed to confirm that this was really happening and not some nightmare I'd eventually wake up from. I called Thomas immediately, and his response was instant and protective. "Don't go out there alone," he said firmly. "Margaret and I are 20 minutes away. Wait for us." But I couldn't wait. 20 years of questions, of wondering why I wasn't worth keeping, of trying to understand what I'd done wrong. All of it was standing at my gate, and I needed answers now. I walked through my house, each step feeling surreal. This beautiful home I'd worked so hard for, with its carefully chosen furniture and artwork that reflected the person I'd become. It all felt fragile suddenly, like the life I'd built could be demolished by the 3 people waiting outside. Security had them standing just beyond the gate, maintaining a professional distance. As I approached, I saw them clearly for the first time in 20 years. My father looked older, grayer, with the same hard set to his jaw I remembered from childhood. My mother was smaller than I remembered, diminished somehow, her eyes darting nervously between her husband and me. And my sister, she was a stranger, a grown woman I wouldn't have recognized on the street. They were holding cheap gas station flowers, the kind you grab as an afterthought, and wearing smiles that didn't reach their eyes. "Dana," my father said, his voice dripping with false warmth. "Look at you. Our daughter all grown up and successful. We're so proud of you." The word daughter coming from his mouth felt like a violation. I wrapped my arms around myself, a protective gesture I hadn't made since childhood. "What do you want?" I asked, skipping past any pretense of reunion sentiment. "We wanted to see you," my mother said softly, speaking for the first time. Her voice was exactly as I remembered, quiet, tentative, always deferring. "To reconnect with our little girl." "I'm not your little girl," I said, the words coming out harder than I'd intended. "You lost the right to call me that when you drove away from a gas station and left me to freeze in the dark." My father's expression flickered a flash of something ugly beneath the forced pleasantness. "Now that's not fair. We were struggling back then, dealing with things you were too young to understand. We thought we were doing what was best." "Best for who?" I interrupted. "Because it certainly wasn't best for me." The mask was slipping now. My father's jaw tightened, and he took a step closer to the gate. "We spent 8 years raising you, feeding you clothing, you keeping a roof over your head. That wasn't free, Dana. And now you're living in this mansion making millions, and you can't even spare some money for the people who gave you life, for your mother who's sick and struggling." There it was. The real reason for the visit, stripped of all pretense. They didn't want reconciliation or closure. They wanted compensation. "You didn't raise me," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. You neglected me. You abused me. You left me alone in the cold and drove away laughing. The people who raised me are Margaret and Thomas Marshall, and they're the only family I have. My sister spoke up for the first time, her voice higher and whinier than I expected. That's so unfair, Dana. We're blood. We're your real family. You owe us. I owe you nothing, I said firmly. My father's expression hardened into something familiar, the anger that always preceded violence when I was young. You listen to me, he said, his voice dropping to that dangerous tone I remembered too well. If you don't do the right thing here, if you don't help your family when we need it, we'll go public. We'll tell everyone the truth about Dana Knight, how you abandoned your poor elderly parents, how you got rich and forgot where you came from, how you turned your back on the people who sacrificed everything for you. Is that a threat? A voice said from behind me. Thomas had arrived, Margaret beside him, and he was holding his phone at an angle that clearly captured the entire gate area. Because it sounds like extortion, and I'm recording every word of this conversation, which is completely legal under this state's one-party consent law. My father's eyes narrowed dangerously. You're recording us. I am, Thomas said calmly. I'm also documenting the fact that you've shown up uninvited at my daughter's home, made financial demands, and threatened her with public defamation if she doesn't comply. Would you like to continue this conversation, or would you prefer to leave now? The word daughter, when Thomas said it, carried weight and truth. It reminded me who my real father was, and it wasn't the man standing at my gate. My biological father glared at Thomas, then at me, his face reddening with fury. This isn't over, he said, his voice low and venomous. You can't just throw away your family and act like we don't exist. We have rights. We'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are. Leave, I said quietly, and don't come back. They left, but not before my father made a show of throwing the cheap flowers on the ground, and my mother cast one last pleading look in my direction. My sister just stared at the mansion with naked envy before following our parents to their beaten-down car. From inside the house, I saw Margaret standing at the window. When our eyes met, I saw tears streaming down her face. She'd watched the entire confrontation, witnessed these people trying to extract money from the daughter they'd abandoned, and I could see her heart breaking for me. Thomas put his arm around my shoulders as we watched them drive away. They'll be back, he said quietly. People like that don't give up when they smell money. We need to call your lawyer. Now. He was right. I knew he was right. But I still felt like that 8-year-old girl watching taillights disappear, still wondering what I'd done to deserve this. The call came the next morning at 7 a.m. My lawyer, David Chen, didn't bother with pleasantries. Dana, we have a problem. Your biological family has filed a lawsuit. They're claiming elder neglect and demanding monthly financial support for medical care and living expenses plus emotional damages for the pain of being estranged from their daughter. They're asking for millions. I sat down heavily, the air rushing out of my lungs. The past wasn't just clawing its way back, it was taking me to court. David assembled a legal team within 48 hours, and we began building our defense. The lawsuit claimed I had a moral and legal obligation to support my elderly parents, that I'd abandoned them in their time of need, despite having the means to help, and that my refusal to assist them had caused severe emotional distress. The dollar amounts they were requesting made my head spin: monthly support payments, medical expenses, compensation for years of alleged suffering. It was extortion dressed up in legal language. We need evidence, David said during our first strategy meeting. Not just your testimony about what happened, but concrete proof that contradicts their narrative. Documentation of the abandonment, the welfare fraud investigation, anything that establishes their credibility is compromised. That's when Thomas suggested something that seemed impossible. What about security footage from the gas station? It was a long shot, but if any record existed... David looked skeptical. That was 20 years ago. Most businesses don't keep footage longer than a few months, maybe a year at most. But it's worth trying, Margaret insisted. If there's even a chance. David assigned one of his junior associates to track down the gas station's ownership history and contact anyone who might have access to old records. I didn't let myself hope. 20 years was a lifetime in terms of data storage. The chances of that footage still existing were astronomical. 3 weeks later, the associate called David with news that seemed too good to be true. The gas station had been owned by the same family for 35 years, and when they'd finally sold it 5 years ago, the old manager had insisted on keeping the archived security tapes in his personal storage unit. He was a meticulous man who believed in preserving records, even ones that seemed irrelevant. When approached about footage from a specific date in the past, he'd agreed to search his collection. It took him another 2 weeks to find the right tapes buried in boxes labeled by year and month. When he finally located the recording from that October night, he called David immediately. "You're going to want to see this," he said. The legal team viewed the footage first, wanting to assess its contents before showing it to me. David called me into his office 3 days later, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes revealing something significant. "Dana, we found the tape, but before you watch it, I want you to understand that this is going to be difficult. Seeing this footage means reliving that night in ways you probably haven't had to face in years. Margaret and Thomas are here if you want them present, and we can stop the playback at any time." Margaret was already reaching for my hand before I'd even agreed to watch. Thomas positioned himself on my other side, solid and steady. I nodded at David, and he pressed play. The footage was grainy and black and white, the timestamp in the corner reading a date and time I'd never forgotten. I watched my family's car pull into the gas station lot, watched it park near the pumps. For a moment, nothing happened, and I could almost convince myself this was a normal stop, that I'd misremembered everything. Then my father got out of the driver's seat. Even in the poor quality video, I could see the anger in his movements, the aggressive set of his shoulders. He walked to the back door, opened it, and yanked something out my small backpack. He threw it onto the pavement with force, then slammed the door shut. I could see my small figure in the back window, and even though I couldn't hear the audio yet, I knew I was crying. My mother got out of the passenger seat, hesitated, looked back at the car. For just a moment, I thought she might do something, might intervene, might choose her daughter over her husband's rage. But then my father barked something at her, and she got back in the car without looking back. David turned up the audio. The sound quality was poor, but it was enough. I heard my own voice, small and terrified, calling, "Mommy, please!" I heard my father's harsh voice saying, "Get in the car now!" And then, as the car pulled away, I heard what I'd remembered, but tried to convince myself I'd imagined laughter. My father's mocking laugh, my sister's childish giggle, and underneath it all, my desperate sobbing. My hands started shaking so violently that Margaret had to grip them tightly to keep them still. I watched my 8-year-old self standing alone in that empty lot, watched her pick up the backpack and clutch it to her chest, watched her look desperately down the highway in both directions, as if trying to decide which way to go. "There's more," David said gently. "Keep watching." The timestamp jumped forward by about 10 minutes. The camera angle shifted to capture the back of the gas station, and I saw a figure I immediately recognized even after 20 years. My father. He was carrying papers, lots of them, and he approached a metal trash can near the back entrance. He looked around furtively, checking to make sure he was alone, then pulled out a lighter. I watched him burn document after document, feeding them into the can and making sure each one was completely consumed before adding the next. The timestamp on the footage matched exactly with the timeline of the welfare fraud investigation that the marshals had told me about years ago. This was the evidence, the papers that connected me to their household, the proof of their fraud. He was destroying it all, erasing me from their records as thoroughly as he'd erased me from their lives. The footage ended, and the office was silent, except for my ragged breathing. Margaret was crying quietly beside me, and Thomas had his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle jumping. "This proves everything," David said quietly. "Premeditation. The deliberate abandonment. The destruction of evidence. Their entire lawsuit is built on the premise that they're loving parents who were sadly estranged from their daughter. This video proves they're liars. I stared at the frozen screen at the image of my father destroying documents and felt something shift inside me. For 20 years, I'd carried a small seed of doubt. Maybe I'd misunderstood. Maybe they'd been desperate and scared. Maybe I'd been too young to fully grasp what was happening. But this footage erased all doubt. My abandonment had been calculated, planned, and executed without hesitation or remorse. "I want to use this," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "I want everyone to see what they did. I want the truth told publicly and irrefutably. This isn't just about defending myself anymore. This is about making sure what they did to me is never hidden or rewritten or explained away." David nodded. "We'll file it with the court and release it to select media outlets. This changes everything." I left his office feeling simultaneously validated and hollow. The proof existed. I hadn't been crazy or oversensitive or wrong. But having evidence of your worst trauma evidence that could be played and replayed for strangers to analyze felt like being violated all over again in a different way. The next morning, my publicist called with an urgent warning. "Dana, we just got a tip from a source at Channel 12. Your biological family is scheduled to appear on their morning talk show tomorrow. They're going to tell their side of the story, and from what we're hearing, they're not holding back." I watched the interview from my home office, Margaret and Thomas on either side of me, all of us silent as my biological parents performed for the cameras. They'd chosen a local morning show with a host known for emotional human interest stories, someone who wouldn't ask hard questions or demand evidence. My father looked appropriately aged and frail, though I noticed he'd somehow managed to seem stronger and more threatening just days ago at my gate. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her hands trembling as she spoke. My sister sat between them, playing the role of concerned, heartbroken daughter and sister. "We searched everywhere for her," my mother was saying, her voice breaking. "When we realized she'd run away, we called the police, we drove around for hours, we were terrified something terrible had happened to our little girl." The host, a woman in her 40s with perfectly styled hair and sympathetic eyes, leaned forward with concern. "And you never found her?" "Not until recently," my father said, his voice heavy with manufactured sorrow. "We saw her on television, this successful woman hosting her own show, and we thought maybe finally we could reconnect. We were so proud of what she'd accomplished. But when we tried to reach out," he let the sentence trail off meaningfully. "She refused to see us," my sister finished. "We just wanted a relationship with her to be part of her life again. But she's changed. The money, the fame, it's like she's forgotten where she came from, forgotten the people who raised her and loved her." I felt Thomas's hand tighten on my shoulder. Margaret made a sound of disgust low in her throat. The host turned to the camera with an expression of practiced concern. "It's heartbreaking when success drives a wedge between families. Dana Knight has built her career on messages of compassion and second chances, but according to her parents, she's refused to offer those same chances to the people who gave her life." My phone started buzzing immediately. Text messages, emails, social media notifications, all flooding in at once. My publicist sent an urgent message. "We need to respond. People are believing this." But David had advised me to stay silent until we could release the security footage through proper legal channels. Responding emotionally would only make me look defensive. So I watched as the lies spread, watched as my biological parents painted themselves as victims, and me as a cruel, ungrateful daughter who'd abandoned them in their time of need. The comment sections on social media were brutal. "She's built her whole career on helping people but can't help her own parents," one user wrote. "This is disgusting. Blood is thicker than water." Another added, "Once you get rich and famous, you forget the people who sacrificed for you. Typical." But there were defenders, too. People who pointed out the suspicious timing, who questioned why these loving, searching parents had waited 20 years to come forward, who noted that their story had convenient holes. "Something doesn't add up here," one comment read. "If they were so desperate to find her, why no missing child report? Why wait until she's worth millions?" The internet became a battlefield, and I was trapped in the middle of it. 2 days after the interview aired, David called with more troubling news. They've submitted additional evidence to the court. Photographs allegedly showing you with your parents throughout your childhood and letters they claim to have sent you over the years that you never answered. That's impossible, I said immediately. I haven't seen them since I was 8, and they never sent letters. Never. I know, David said. And we can prove it. The photos are obviously doctored. I can see the manipulation with my naked eye, and our digital forensics expert will have no trouble demonstrating they're fake. The metadata on the files shows they were created 3 weeks ago, and the letters are printed on paper stock that didn't exist 20 years ago. The whole thing is a fraud, but it's a convincing fraud to someone who doesn't look closely. How long to expose it? I asked. We're working as fast as we can, but these things take time. Forensic analysis, official reports, expert testimony, we need everything ironclad. In the meantime, they're going to keep pushing this narrative. He was right. Over the next week, my biological family appeared on 2 more talk shows, each time refining their performance, adding details that made their story more sympathetic. They talked about struggling financially while raising me, about the sacrifices they'd made, about how much it hurt to be rejected by the daughter they loved. The fabricated letters they'd submitted to the court somehow leaked to the media. They were heartbreaking to read, full of apologies and expressions of love, claiming they'd been writing to me for years, but never received responses. We understand you're building a new life, one letter read, but please know that we love you and we're proud of you. You'll always be our daughter no matter what. If I hadn't known with absolute certainty that I'd never received these letters, that they'd been created recently to support a false narrative, I might have been moved by them. They were expertly crafted to make me look cold and unforgiving. My show's ratings started to slip. Sponsors began making concerned calls to the network. The comments on my social media posts turned increasingly hostile. I was hemorrhaging public support with every passing day, and all I could do was wait for the legal process to catch up to the lies. Margaret found me late one night, sitting in the dark, scrolling through comment after comment, calling me heartless, greedy, cruel. She sat down beside me and gently took the phone from my hands. "Let the truth speak louder than their lies," she said firmly. "It always does in the end. They can perform for cameras and fabricate evidence, but we have reality on our side. The security footage, the court documents, the welfare fraud investigation, all of it will come out. You just have to be patient." "I'm not good at being patient when people are destroying my reputation," I admitted. "I know," she said softly. "But this is when your strength matters most. When it would be easier to fight back emotionally, you're choosing to let the truth do the fighting. That takes more courage than people realize." The next morning, David called with news that made my heart race. "We've been contacted by someone claiming to have witnessed your abandonment. A man named Langford who says he lived near your biological family and saw everything that happened. He wants to testify." "That's incredible," I said, feeling hope surge for the first time in days. "There's a catch," David said carefully. "He's asking for money. He says he took risks staying quiet all these years, that your father paid him off once to keep silent about what he saw, and now he wants compensation for coming forward." The hope evaporated, replaced by nausea. Even the truth, it seemed, had a price tag attached. David arranged a meeting with Mr. Langford at his law office 3 days later. I insisted on being present, needing to see this man who claimed to have witnessed my childhood, but chose silence over intervention. Thomas came with me, his protective presence a comfort as we walked into the conference room. Mr. Langford was in his early 60s with graying hair and a weathered face that spoke of a hard life. He sat across from us, his hands fidgeting nervously with a coffee cup, unable to meet my eyes directly. The shame radiated off him in waves that were almost palpable. "I lived next door to your family from the time you were about 5 until you were 8, he began, his voice rough. "I saw things, heard things, your father screaming at you for hours. You locked outside in bad weather, the way he'd grab you by the arm hard enough to leave bruises, your mother just standing there doing nothing." I felt my chest tighten, memories I'd tried to bury forcing their way to the surface. Thomas placed his hand on mine under the table. "I called it in once. Mr. Langford continued, finally looking up at me. Anonymous tip to Child Services. They came out, investigated, but your father was smooth. He had explanations for everything, made it seem like I was just a nosy neighbor exaggerating normal family discipline. And then a week later, he showed up at my door with $500 cash. He paid you to stay quiet, David said, his voice neutral, but his pen moving rapidly across his legal pad. He did, and I took it. The shame in Mr. Langford's voice was thick. I told myself I'd tried to help, that the system had failed you, not me. But the truth is, I was broke and scared, and $500 was a lot of money to me back then. So I kept my mouth shut even when I heard him talking on the phone about welfare fraud, about how he needed to reduce the head count before the state auditors came around. Even when I saw your family's car pull out of the driveway that night with you in the back, and then return 20 minutes later without you. My breath caught. You saw them leave without me. I did. I noticed because it was late and I was up watching TV. I saw the car leave and I counted the people in it on the way back. You weren't there anymore. I thought maybe you'd gone to stay with relatives or something, tried to convince myself it was normal. But a few days later, when I saw police and social workers at the house, I knew something was very wrong. But you didn't come forward, I said quietly. No, I was a coward. And that guilt has eaten at me every single day for 20 years. He finally met my eyes fully. When I saw your father on television lying about searching for you, claiming to be a victim, I couldn't stomach it anymore. I have to tell the truth. I have to make this right. David leaned forward. Mr. Langford, we appreciate you coming forward. But I need to ask you directly, are you requesting payment for your testimony? Mr. Langford's face flushed. I'm asking for fair compensation for the risk I'm taking. Your father threatened me once before. If I testify against him, there could be consequences. I think that deserves some consideration. Before David could respond, Thomas interjected. You're asking to be paid for telling the truth about a crime you witnessed and initially covered up. That's not compensation. That's selling testimony. It compromises everything you say. I have financial troubles, Mr. Langford said defensively. Medical bills, debt. I'm not asking for much, just enough to— Enough, I said, cutting him off. The word came out sharper than I intended, but I was suddenly furious. You stood by while I was abused. You took money to keep quiet about it. And now you want me to pay you to finally do what you should have done 20 years ago. David spent the next hour asking detailed questions, and his investigator started running background checks immediately. What they found was troubling. Mr. Langford had moved 6 times in the past 10 years, always staying just ahead of creditors. He had outstanding debts, a history of small-time cons, and most concerning recent phone records showed multiple calls from a number that traced back to my biological father. When David confronted him about the calls, Mr. Langford admitted that my father had reached out 2 weeks ago before the lawsuit was filed. He wanted to know what I remembered, what I might say if anyone asked. He offered me money to keep quiet, or to say I didn't remember anything clearly. I told him no. I swear I did. But he knows you're vulnerable, David said. He knows you need money, and now you're here asking Dana for payment. How do we know you won't sell your testimony to whoever pays more? The question hung in the air, unanswerable, because we all knew it was valid. That evening I sat with Margaret and Thomas in their living room, wrestling with the decision. Mr. Langford could potentially provide powerful testimony, but his credibility was compromised by his past and his current financial desperation. What should I do? I asked Margaret. She was quiet for a long moment before responding. If we use a compromised witness, if we pay someone to tell the truth, we become no better than them. We sink to their level of manipulation and deception. You have the security footage. You have official documents. You have the truth without needing to buy it from someone who already failed you once. She was right, and I knew it. The next day, David called Mr. Langford and explained our position. We wouldn't pay for his testimony, but we would help him give a voluntary statement to authorities about the bribery he'd witnessed and participated in. Not to help my case, but to allow him to clear his conscience legally. Mr. Langford was furious. "You people are all the same," he spat over the phone, his voice carrying through David's speakerphone. "You use people up and throw them away. I'm trying to do the right thing, and you're treating me like I'm the criminal." "You were complicit in covering up child abuse," David said calmly. "Making a voluntary statement to authorities about what you witnessed is the right thing. Selling that testimony to the highest bidder is not." Mr. Langford hung up without another word, and I felt a sense of unease settle over me. A man that desperate, that angry, could be unpredictable. My instincts proved correct the next morning when my publicist called, her voice tight with stress. "Dana, we have a problem. Tabloids are running a story. The headline is, 'TV host accused of bribing witness in family lawsuit.'" My stomach dropped. "What?" "Mr. Langford apparently went to the press claiming you offered him money to testify falsely against your parents, and when he refused, you tried to intimidate him into silence. He's positioned himself as a man of integrity, being pressured by your expensive lawyers." I closed my eyes, feeling the walls closing in. The man who'd taken money to cover up my abuse was now accusing me of bribery, and the media was eating it up. The Langford story dominated headlines for exactly 2 days before my biological family struck again, this time with something far more damaging. My publicist called at 6 a.m, her voice shaking. "They've released audio," she said. "Dana, it's bad, really bad." The clips were everywhere within hours, on news websites, social media, played on morning shows, with shocked hosts discussing what they'd heard. In the recordings, my voice was cold, almost cruel. One clip had me saying, "I don't care if you suffer, you deserve nothing from me." Another had me threatening, "Stay away, or I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of people you really are." A third featured me saying something that sounded like, "You're not my family and you never were. I owe you nothing but contempt." I listened to them in horror, recognizing fragments of my voice, but not the context. These were words spliced together from different conversations, sentences cut and rearranged to create meanings I'd never intended. The clip about not caring if they suffered was actually from 2 different sentences. "I don't care" had come from a conversation about their lawsuit strategy, and "if you suffer" was from something else entirely. They'd been edited together so seamlessly that even I had trouble hearing the manipulation at first. David's team immediately hired audio forensics experts who could prove the recordings were doctored, but the damage was already done. The clips spread like wildfire, shared and reshared by people who took them at face value. Comments poured in from viewers, many of them older women who'd been my core audience. "I can't believe I trusted her," one wrote. "She seemed so kind and genuine, but this is who she really is, cold and heartless to her own parents." Another added, "My mother always said people show their true colors when money gets involved. Dana Knight got rich and forgot about basic human decency." The cognitive dissonance was painful to watch. These were people who'd watched my show for years, who'd written to me about how my message of compassion had helped them through difficult times. Now they couldn't reconcile the person they thought they knew with the monster the audio clips portrayed. Within 48 hours, 3 major sponsors pulled their support. Their press releases were carefully worded, reassessing brand partnerships in light of recent developments, and ensuring alignment with company values. But the message was clear. They didn't want to be associated with someone accused of elder abuse and cruelty. The network executives called a meeting. They sat across from me in a conference room, their expressions uncomfortable but determined. "Dana, we think it might be best if you took a temporary leave of absence," the programming director said. "Just until the legal situation resolves and public sentiment shifts. We're not canceling your show, just pausing production for a few weeks." "A few weeks that could turn into forever," I said quietly. No one contradicted me because we all knew it was true. In television, momentum was everything. Take a show off the air and viewers found other programs to watch. They moved on, and sometimes they never came back. My inbox became a nightmare. Hate mail flooded in faster than my assistant could filter it. You're a disgrace. How do you sleep at night knowing you abandoned your elderly parents? I hope karma comes for you. You're everything that's wrong with successful people, selfish, cold, and fake. Each message felt like a small knife, but cumulatively they created a wound I didn't know how to heal. I'd built my entire career on authenticity and empathy, on making people feel seen and understood. Now those same people were calling me a fraud and a liar, and part of me started to wonder if they were right. Maybe I was broken in ways I'd never fully acknowledged. Maybe I was cold and damaged and incapable of normal family love. I stopped eating, stopped sleeping properly, spent hours scrolling through comments and articles torturing myself with the public's growing hatred. My show's ratings, which had once been my source of pride, were now a daily reminder of my fall. The numbers dropped week after week as viewers abandoned me the way my biological parents once had. Margaret found me 3 days into this spiral, sitting in my darkened apartment surrounded by printouts of hate mail and declining ratings reports. She took one look at me and immediately sat down, pulling me into her arms the way she had when I was 8 years old and newly traumatized. "This has to stop," she said firmly. "You're letting them destroy you, and I won't watch that happen. They're winning, Margaret. They're turning everyone against me with lies, and I can't fight back fast enough. The truth takes time to prove, but lies spread instantly. Listen to me." Margaret's voice was weaker than usual, and I noticed for the first time how thin she'd become, how the illness she'd been fighting was taking its toll. But her spirit was as fierce as ever. "You survived being abandoned at 8 years old. You survived believing you were worthless. You survived years of thinking you weren't worth loving. You survived when no one was there to fight for you. You can survive this too, because this time you're not alone." "But what if the damage is permanent? What if I never get my reputation back?" "Then you build a new one," she said simply. "You've done it before. You went from being a discarded child to one of the most respected voices in media. If you have to do it again, you will. Because that's who you are, not the person they're trying to paint you as, but the person who refuses to stay broken." Thomas had been working tirelessly behind the scenes with David's legal team. While I'd been spiraling, he'd been gathering evidence, coordinating with forensics experts, and building an ironclad case. He came by that evening with updates, his methodical engineer's mind providing a roadmap through the chaos. "The audio experts have definitively proven the recordings are fake," he explained, showing me spectral analysis reports I barely understood. "We can demonstrate exactly where the cuts were made, where sentences were spliced together. We have the original security footage from your gate showing the actual conversation, which proves your words were taken out of context. And we're ready to file countercharges for defamation and fraud." "How long until we can release all of this?" I asked. "David wants everything filed with the court first, then released publicly in a coordinated way. Maybe a week, 10 days maximum. I know it feels like forever, but we need to do this right." I nodded, trying to hold on to the hope that the truth would eventually prevail, even as my professional life crumbled around me. That evening, as Thomas was leaving, his phone rang. I watched his expression change from calm to alarmed in seconds. He grabbed his keys with shaking hands, his face suddenly pale. "It's the hospital," he said, his voice breaking. "Margaret collapsed at home. The neighbor found her. They're taking her to emergency now." I drove to the hospital with Thomas, both of us silent, except for his occasional directions to turn or merge. My mind kept replaying Margaret's words from earlier that day, her fierce insistence that I could survive this. Now she was the one fighting to survive, and the irony was crushing. The emergency room was chaos, nurses rushing between curtained areas, monitors beeping overhead pages, calling doctors to various locations. Thomas spoke urgently with a nurse who led us to a private room where Margaret lay connected to monitors and an IV line. She looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, her skin pale against the white sheets, her breathing shallow. A doctor met us outside the room, a kind-faced woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Dr. Patel. "Mrs. Marshall's heart is significantly weakened," she explained, her tone gentle but honest. "She's been dealing with cardiac issues for some time, but the recent stress has accelerated the deterioration. The constant anxiety, elevated blood pressure, irregular sleep, all of it has taken a severe toll. Will she be okay? I asked, hating how my voice cracked on the last word. We're doing everything we can to stabilize her, but I need you to understand that her condition is serious. She needs rest, peace, and absolutely no stress. The next few days will be critical. I sat beside Margaret's bed, holding her hand carefully to avoid disturbing the IV. Her eyes were closed, her face relaxed in medicated sleep, and I felt guilt wash over me in waves so powerful I could barely breathe. This was my fault. If I'd just ignored my biological family's initial contact, if I'd refused to engage with their demands, if I'd stayed silent and let them say whatever they wanted about me, Margaret wouldn't be here. She'd be home safe, healthy. Thomas seemed to read my thoughts. "Don't do that," he said quietly from the chair on the other side of the bed. "Don't blame yourself for their cruelty. They're the ones who showed up at your gate making demands. They're the ones who filed a fraudulent lawsuit and spread lies. You're not responsible for their choices or the stress those choices created." But logic couldn't erase the crushing weight of guilt. I watched Margaret breathe each rise and fall of her chest, a reminder of how fragile life was, how quickly everything could be taken away. As the hours passed and Margaret continued to sleep, my mind wandered through memories comparing the two women who'd held the title of mother in my life. I remembered Margaret sitting beside my bed during those first terrifying nights in her home, reading stories until I fell asleep, because she knew I was afraid of the dark. I remembered her teaching me to bake cookies patient when I spilled flour everywhere, laughing when we both ended up covered in ingredients. I remembered her at every school event, every award ceremony, every moment of my life that mattered, cheering louder than anyone else in the room. Then I thought of my biological mother, a shadow in my memories, always present, but never protective. I remembered her face appearing briefly in the window while I stood locked outside in the rain. Remembered how she'd look away when my father started yelling. Remembered the way she'd climbed back into the car without hesitation the night they abandoned me. She'd been there physically, but she'd never been there in any way that mattered. One woman had chosen to love me when she had no obligation to do so. The other had chosen to abandon me when every moral and legal obligation said she should protect me. The distinction had never been clearer or more painful. Margaret stirred around midnight, her eyes opening slowly. She looked confused for a moment, taking in the hospital room before her gaze found mine. "Dana," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I'm here. I'm so sorry, Margaret. This is all my fault. If I hadn't—" "Stop." The word was weak, but firm. She squeezed my hand with surprising strength for someone so frail. "Don't you dare give up. Don't you dare let them win by making you believe you're not worth fighting for. You're in the hospital because of the stress I brought into your life. I'm in the hospital because I have a weak heart that's been failing for 2 years, she corrected. The stress didn't help, but Dana listened to me. Your story could change lives. There are children out there right now who feel the way you once felt, worthless, abandoned, convinced they're the problem. If you let your biological family silence you, if you retreat and hide, those children lose the voice they desperately need. Tears streamed down my face. I don't know if I'm strong enough. You are. You've always been strong enough. You just sometimes forget. She paused, catching her breath. Promise me. Promise me you won't give up. Promise me you'll fight for the truth, not for yourself, but for every child who needs to know they can survive what you survived. I promise, I whispered, gripping her hand tighter. Good. Margaret's eyes were already closing again, exhaustion pulling her back toward sleep. Now go. Work with David and Thomas. Build your case. Show the world who you really are, not who they're trying to paint you as. I'll be fine. I'm tougher than I look. I stayed until she was sleeping peacefully again, then kissed her forehead and left Thomas to keep watch. The hospital corridors seemed endless as I walked toward the exit, but I felt different than I had when I'd arrived. The guilt was still there, heavy and persistent, but it was joined now by determination. Margaret was right, this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about truth, justice, and making sure that her sacrifice, her love, her fight meant something. I called David from my car, not caring that it was nearly 1 a.m. "I need you to go on the offensive," I said when he answered. "No more waiting for the perfect moment. I want the security footage released. I want the audio forensics report made public. I want countercharges filed for defamation, fraud, and anything else we can make stick. I want them to understand that I'm not backing down." "Dana, are you sure? Once we release everything, there's no taking it back. The media circus will intensify." "I'm sure. Margaret just made me promise not to give up, and I don't break promises to her, ever." "All right," David said, and I could hear him already making notes. "Give me until morning to coordinate everything. We'll file with the court first thing and release the evidence to select media outlets by noon. This changes the entire trajectory of the case." I hung up feeling more focused than I had in days. The next morning, I was in David's office reviewing strategy when his phone rang. He answered, listened for a moment, then his expression shifted to something I'd never seen before, shock mixed with triumph. "Dana," he said slowly, covering the phone's receiver. "My investigator just found something in the sealed court archives, a document that could end their lawsuit immediately. You need to see this." David had the document couriered over within the hour. I sat in his office with Thomas beside me as he carefully removed it from a sealed evidence folder. The paper was yellowed with age, the date stamp in the corner reading, "A night I would never forget, October 15th, over 20 years ago." "This is an informal abandonment statement," David explained, handling the document with almost reverent care. "It's not a formal legal relinquishment that would require court approval, but it's a signed acknowledgement from your biological parents to the State Social Services Department." I read the typed text, my hands trembling. The language was bureaucratic and cold. "We, the undersigned, acknowledge that we are unable and unwilling to care for the minor child, Dana Elizabeth Knight, age 8. We request that the state find alternative placement for said child, as we cannot provide adequate care for her needs at this time." Below the typed statement were 2 signatures, my father's bold and aggressive, my mother's smaller and hesitant. Both were dated October 15th, the same night they'd abandoned me at the gas station. "They signed this the same night?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. According to the timestamps and case notes, a social worker met with them approximately 6 hours after police first made contact. "Your parents signed this statement voluntarily without coercion. They were asked repeatedly if they wanted time to reconsider, and they declined." Thomas leaned forward, reading over my shoulder. "This proves they didn't search for her. They didn't want her back. They literally asked the state to take her away." "There's more," David said, turning the page to reveal a handwritten note on official letterhead. "This is from your father, written in his own hand and signed." I read the words, each one landing like a physical blow. "The child would be better off elsewhere. We cannot provide for her needs. This is the best decision for everyone involved." The clinical detachment was devastating. Not our daughter or even Dana, just the child. Not "we love her but can't care for her." Just cold statements of fact presented as if he were returning a defective appliance rather than abandoning his daughter. "How does this affect their lawsuit?" I asked, trying to focus on the legal implications rather than the emotional devastation. "It destroys their credibility entirely," David said. "They've been claiming they're loving parents who were separated from their daughter through tragic circumstances, that they searched for you and mourned your absence. But this document proves they voluntarily gave you up. They can't claim they wanted you back when they literally signed paperwork asking the state to take you away." "But why didn't this prevent them from filing the lawsuit in the first place?" Thomas asked, his engineer's mind seeking logical consistency. "Because this isn't a formal legal relinquishment," David explained. "Those require court approval and permanently terminate parental rights. This is more informal. It's the parents saying they can't or won't care for the child and asking for state intervention. Technically, they could have requested to get Dana back within a certain time frame, though they never did. And because the marshals went through proper adoption proceedings, all parental rights were eventually legally terminated anyway." But this document proves their current narrative is a complete fabrication. Thomas noticed something else in the case file. What's this about another family being interested in adopting Dana? David pulled out additional paperwork, his expression darkening as he read. This is interesting. According to these notes, another family expressed serious interest in adopting Dana about 2 months before the marshals began the process. The preliminary paperwork was started, background checks were underway, but then the process mysteriously stalled. He continued reading, flipping through pages of bureaucratic notes and timestamps. And here's why. Your father repeatedly called the social services office trying to retract the abandonment statement. Not because he wanted Dana back, the case notes specifically mention he never asked to have her returned to the home. He was concerned about documentation that could be misused in other investigations. The welfare fraud investigation, I said, understanding flooding through me. Exactly. He wanted Dana out of his household to avoid fraud detection, but he didn't want official paperwork proving he'd abandoned her, because that same paperwork could be used as evidence that she'd been in his care to begin with. He tried to manipulate the system. Get rid of Dana without leaving a paper trail. His interference caused so much confusion that the first adoption fell through. The interested family got frustrated with the delays and moved on. Thomas's face was red with anger. So another family could have given Dana a home months earlier, but he sabotaged it to protect himself from fraud charges. Not because he wanted his daughter back, but because he was worried about covering his tracks. That's exactly what these documents suggest, David confirmed. I stared at the papers spread across David's desk, seeing my entire childhood trauma laid out in bureaucratic language and official stamps. Every decision my biological father had made was about protecting himself, about gaming the system, about avoiding consequences. I had never been a daughter to him. I'd been a problem to be solved, evidence to be disposed of, an inconvenience to be eliminated. When can we file this with the court? I asked. I want to do it first thing tomorrow morning, along with the security footage and the audio forensics report. We'll release everything simultaneously, a coordinated presentation of evidence that systematically destroys every claim they've made. That night, I returned to the hospital to sit with Margaret. She was awake and slightly stronger, though still frighteningly pale. I told her about the document, about the proof of abandonment, about how close we were to exposing the truth. I knew there had to be something, she said quietly. People don't just abandon children without leaving traces. They always think they're cleverer than they are, that they can cover their tracks completely. But the truth has a way of surviving. I was still holding her hand when Thomas burst into the room, his phone pressed to his ear and his expression alarmed. He ended his call and turned to us with barely controlled fury. They've hired a PR firm, a big one. According to David's contacts in the media, your biological family is launching an aggressive public relations campaign starting tomorrow. Press conferences, more television appearances, social media blitzes. They're going all in to control the narrative before we can release our evidence. Then we release it tonight, I said immediately. David says we need the court filings to go through first, or we risk compromising the legal case. But that means they'll have at least 12 hours of unopposed media time to spread more lies. Margaret squeezed my hand. 12 hours is nothing compared to 20 years of silence. Let them have their moment. The truth will speak louder. I hoped she was right. But as I watched Thomas coordinate frantically with David's team, trying to accelerate their timeline, I couldn't shake the feeling that the next day would be a battle unlike anything we'd faced so far. The PR campaign launched exactly as Thomas had warned. My biological parents appeared on morning shows across 3 different networks, their performance polished and coordinated. They had professional makeup, carefully chosen outfits that made them look humble but dignified, and talking points that hit every emotional note designed to generate sympathy. But David had worked through the night, and by 10 a.m., our response was ready. The court filings went through first the security footage, the abandonment statement, the audio forensics report proving the recordings were manipulated, all entered into the official record. Then, with meticulous timing, David's team released everything to major news outlets simultaneously. The Associated Press, Reuters, 3 national networks, and 2 major newspapers all received the evidence package at exactly 10:15. By 11, the first stories were breaking. I watched from my apartment as the narrative I'd lived with privately for 20 years became public knowledge. News anchors introduced segments with grave expressions warning viewers that the footage they were about to see was disturbing. Then they played the grainy black and white video of my father throwing my backpack onto the pavement, my small figure visible in the car window, my mother's brief hesitation before climbing back into the passenger seat, the taillights disappearing into the darkness. The audio was devastating. Even through the poor sound quality, my desperate crying was audible, along with the family's laughter fading into the distance. Then the camera angle switched to the back of the gas station, showing my father burning documents, looking around nervously to ensure he wasn't observed. The abandonment statement appeared on screen, next the official letterhead and signatures clearly visible. News anchors read portions aloud, their voices heavy with disbelief. The child would be better off elsewhere. We cannot provide for her needs. The contrast between this evidence and my biological parents' tearful television performances was so stark that even the most skeptical viewers couldn't ignore it. One network played clips side by side, my father claiming, "We searched everywhere for our little girl," next to footage of him deliberately abandoning that same little girl and then destroying evidence. The internet exploded within hours. My phone, which I'd put on silent, showed hundreds of notifications accumulating by the minute. Thomas, who'd come over to watch the news coverage with me, monitored social media on his laptop. "It's shifting," he said, his voice cautious but hopeful. "Look at this." The comment sections that had been filled with vitriol just yesterday were transforming. Women were sharing their own stories of abandonment abuse and family betrayal. "I grew up with a mother who chose her abusive husband over her children," one wrote. "Watching Dana's courage to tell the truth has given me permission to tell mine." Another added, "I'm 67 years old, and I've never told anyone that my father abandoned us when I was 9. Thank you, Dana, for showing me that the truth matters more than shame." The hashtag I stand with Dana began trending. Older women, the core audience that had initially turned against me when the manipulated audio was released, were now flooding back with apologies and support. "I should have known better than to believe edited recordings," one wrote. "Dana, I'm so sorry I doubted you." Television coverage shifted dramatically as networks scrambled to correct their previous sympathetic portrayals of my biological parents. Legal experts were brought on to explain how the abandonment statement destroyed the family's lawsuit. Psychologists discussed the long-term trauma of childhood abandonment and the additional harm of being exploited decades later. Child welfare advocates praised me for bringing attention to issues that often remained hidden. One host who'd featured my biological parents just days earlier issued an on-air apology. "We failed to adequately investigate the claims made by Dana Knight's biological family," she said, her expression genuinely remorseful. "We gave them a platform to spread lies, and we owe Dana and our viewers an apology. The evidence now available makes it clear that she is the victim of calculated cruelty both as a child and now as an adult." By the end of the day, 3 sponsors who'd pulled their support had contacted the network requesting to return. Their public statements were carefully worded, "We made a hasty decision based on incomplete information," and "We deeply regret any harm caused to Ms. Knight." But the message was clear. They wanted back in. The network executives called the next morning. The same programming director who'd suggested I take a temporary leave of absence now spoke enthusiastically about my return. "Dana, your honesty and resilience are exactly what our viewers need to see. We'd like you back on air as soon as possible. We're even considering expanding your show to include more personal storytelling segments, really leaning into your authentic voice." I wanted to feel vindicated, but mostly I felt exhausted. The public's opinion had swung in my favor, yes, but it had swung against me just as quickly when presented with lies. The fickleness of public support was sobering. "I'll come back," I told them, "but on my terms. I want creative control. I want the freedom to tell the stories that matter to me, and I want a platform to advocate for children in situations like the one I survived." They agreed to everything. Over the next week, my show's ratings climbed to heights they'd never reached before. Viewers who'd abandoned me came back bringing friends and family with them. But more importantly, the nature of my audience was changing. People were tuning in not just for inspiration but for truth. They wanted authenticity even when it was painful, especially when it was painful. Letters poured in from viewers sharing their own experiences with family trauma, expressing gratitude that someone with a platform was finally talking openly about the reality of abuse and abandonment. My inbox, which had been filled with hate mail just weeks ago, now overflowed with messages of support and solidarity. I was becoming more than an inspirational talk show host. I was becoming a voice for people who'd spent lifetimes being silenced, a symbol that survival was possible, and that speaking truth mattered more than maintaining comfortable lies. Margaret, still recovering in the hospital, but growing stronger each day, watched my show's triumphant return from her bed. When I visited that evening, she was smiling wider than I'd seen in weeks. "I told you the truth would speak louder," she said. "I'm so proud of you, Dana. Not because you're famous or successful, but because you refuse to let them rewrite your story." I was sitting beside her bed, holding her hand and telling her about the advocacy work I wanted to build into the show when my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The preview on my lock screen made my heart stop. "It's your sister. I need to see you. Alone. Please." I showed the message to Margaret, whose expression immediately grew concerned. "Be careful," she warned. She was part of their lies. This could be another manipulation. "I know," I said quietly. "But what if it's not? What if she's trying to get away from them?" "Then she needs to prove it," Margaret said firmly. "And she needs to do it in a way that doesn't put you at risk. Don't meet her alone, Dana. Whatever she has to say, make sure you have witnesses and protection." I knew Margaret was right, but part of me, the part that still remembered a little girl giggling in the back seat, too young to understand what she was participating in, wondered if my sister might be another victim in all of this, just one who'd taken longer to break free. Against Margaret's explicit advice and Thomas's strong objections, I agreed to meet my sister. But I made compromises. I chose a public park during daylight hours. I told David exactly where I'd be and when, and I drove my car, which Thomas had equipped with recording capabilities after the first confrontation at my gate. I wasn't going in completely unprotected, even if I was going in alone. She was already there when I arrived, sitting on a bench near the duck pond, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd expected. 20 years had turned the giggling child in the back seat into a thin woman in her late 20s, with anxious eyes and nervous hands that wouldn't stop fidgeting with the strap of her purse. I sat down beside her, maintaining some distance, and waited for her to speak first. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I admitted. "Why did you want to see me?" She took a shaky breath, and I noticed tears already forming in her eyes. "Because I need you to know that I never wanted any of this. The lawsuit, the media appearances, the lies, none of it was my idea. Dad forced me to participate. He said if I didn't help him, if I didn't back up his story, he would—" She trailed off her hands, trembling visibly now. "He would what?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "He would do to me what he did when I was younger," she whispered, and the fear in her voice sounded genuine. "Dana, I know you don't remember me well. You left when I was so young, but I grew up in that house after you were gone. It got worse. So much worse. Mom stopped trying to intervene at all, and I became his target for everything." I felt my chest tighten. The possibility that my sister had suffered in ways I'd been spared by being abandoned was something I hadn't fully considered. "What did he do to you?" She flinched at the question, her whole body tensing. "Things I'm still not ready to talk about. Things I'm working through in therapy now. But Dana, you have to understand, when he told me I had to go on those talk shows and say those things about you, I was terrified to say no. I've spent my whole life learning that saying no to him means pain." "What about now?" I asked. "Are you still living with them?" I moved out 6 months ago, but I'm barely surviving. I work 2 jobs just to afford a studio apartment, and Dad still calls me constantly, still tries to control everything I do. When he found out about the lawsuit, he demanded I participate. He said it was family business, and I owed it to them after everything they'd sacrificed to raise me. The story was compelling, and the pain in her eyes looked real. I found myself softening despite my better judgment, recognizing in her fear the same terror I'd once felt around our father. "I'm sorry you went through that," I said carefully. "But you're an adult now. You could have refused. You could have told the truth." "I know," she said, tears spilling over. "I know, and I hate myself for it. But Dana, you got out when you were 8. You had Margaret and Thomas who showed you what real family looks like. I had 20 more years of conditioning, 20 more years of learning that defying him meant consequences I couldn't bear. I'm not making excuses, I'm just trying to explain." She told me about her life, the jobs she worked, the tiny apartment she could barely afford, her desperate attempts to build a life separate from our parents. She talked about our mother with a mixture of pity and anger, describing her as a broken woman who'd given up fighting decades ago. "Does Mom really want to reconcile with me?" I asked. My sister hesitated. "I think part of her does, but she's so beaten down by Dad that I don't know if she has the strength to go against him. She cries sometimes when your show is on TV. She'll watch it and just cry, but she'd never let Dad see." We talked for nearly an hour, and several times I found myself wondering if possibly my sister could be an ally rather than an enemy. Maybe she was another victim trying to break free. Maybe there was hope for some kind of relationship between us, complicated and conditional as it would have to be. "What do you need from me?" I finally asked. "Nothing," she said quickly. "I don't want money or help with the lawsuit or anything like that. I just needed you to know that I'm sorry, that I never wanted to hurt you, that I wish I'd been brave enough to stand up to Dad, but I wasn't." When we parted, she hugged me briefly, the first physical contact I'd had with a biological family member in 20 years, and it felt strange and uncomfortable, but not entirely unwelcome. I drove home feeling confused and emotionally drained. I called Thomas from the road and told him about the meeting, about my sister's claims of abuse and her apparent desire to break free from our father's control. "Be careful," Thomas said immediately. "Everything about this feels convenient. She approaches you right when public opinion has shifted in your favor, right when their lawsuit is falling apart." "Dana, please tell me you were recording." "The car was recording," I confirmed. "You can review the footage." "I'm going to do exactly that. Come straight here when you get home." Thomas had already pulled the footage and audio by the time I arrived at his and Margaret's house. We sat in his home office watching the conversation play back on his computer screen. He ran it through several times, his engineer's mind, analyzing every detail. "Look here," he said, pointing at the screen. "Notice how she keeps steering the conversation. She asks about Margaret's health 3 separate times. She asks directly about your assets. How are you managing financially with all the legal fees? She brings up specific details about the lawsuit that you didn't mention first." I watched the footage again, and with Thomas pointing it out, the pattern became obvious. My sister had been fishing for information, guiding the conversation toward topics that served her purposes rather than letting it flow naturally. "That could just be nervousness," I said, though I was starting to feel doubt creep in. She might have been trying to fill awkward silences. "Maybe," Thomas said, "but listen to this." He enhanced the audio, filtering out background noise and amplifying subtle sounds. That's when I heard it, a faint but distinct clicking sound that occurred multiple times throughout our conversation, always when I was speaking. "That's a recording app," Thomas said grimly. "The click when it starts, the click when it pauses. She was recording you on her phone, Dana, secretly without your consent." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. I'd opened up to her, shared my feelings, expressed compassion for what she'd survived, and she'd been recording it all, probably planning to edit it the same way they'd edited the previous audio to make me sound cruel and heartless. David confirmed my worst fears when Thomas sent him the enhanced audio. "We've intercepted communications suggesting they plan to use this recording," David said during an emergency call. "They're going to edit it to make it sound like you admitted to cutting them off out of spite rather than self-protection. They'll use your words about not knowing if you can have a relationship and twist them into evidence of your coldness." I thought about my sister's tears, her trembling hands, her story of abuse and fear, how much of it had been real and how much had been performance. Had she truly suffered at our father's hands, or had she simply learned his manipulative tactics and deployed them with skill? "They sent her to manipulate you," Margaret said when I visited the hospital later that evening. She'd been released earlier that day but was still weak and recovering at home. "They knew you'd be more vulnerable to her than to your parents. They knew you might feel sympathy for her, might see her as another victim. It was calculated." I stared at the evidence of my sister's betrayal, the enhanced audio showing her secret recording, the analysis of how she'd steered the conversation, the intercepted messages about how they planned to use it. The last fragile hope I'd held that maybe possibly some member of my biological family might have redeeming qualities finally crumbled. I called David with a clarity I hadn't felt before. "It's time to end this," I said, my voice cold and resolved. "No more waiting, no more defensive positioning. I want my day in court. I want to face them directly on the record under oath. I want a jury to hear the truth and see them for exactly who they are. Can we accelerate the trial date?" "I'll file a motion first thing in the morning," David said. "With the evidence we have now, I think we can make a compelling case for expedited proceedings. Are you sure you're ready for this?" "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," I said. "They've lied, manipulated, fabricated evidence, and now they've tried to use my own sister to betray me one more time. I'm done being defensive. It's time they faced the consequences of what they've done." The trial began on a cold Tuesday morning in late November. I arrived at the courthouse with Thomas and David walking past news cameras and reporters shouting questions I'd been advised not to answer. Margaret wanted to be there but was still too weak to sit through what David warned would be long, emotionally exhausting days. She'd made me promise to tell her everything that happened, and I intended to keep that promise. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Media representatives filled the back rows, their cameras and recording devices, ready to capture every moment. Supporters and curious observers crowded the gallery, and I noticed several women who'd written to me after my story went public here to show solidarity. My biological parents sat at the plaintiff's table with their lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Richard Kelso, who specialized in elder law and had built his reputation on sympathetic portrayals of aging clients. I sat beside David at the defense table, forcing myself to maintain composure even though my hands were shaking under the table. Thomas sat directly behind me in the gallery, a steady presence I could feel without turning around. Judge Patricia Morrison, a woman in her early 60s with steel-gray hair and a reputation for no-nonsense jurisprudence, called the court to order. The jury, 7 women and 5 men ranging in age from late 30s to early 70s, settled into their seats, their expressions carefully neutral as they prepared to hear our case. Kelso stood for his opening statement, and I watched as he transformed my biological parents into sympathetic figures with nothing more than words and careful framing. He painted them as elderly, struggling people who'd made difficult decisions during hard times, who'd been separated from their daughter through circumstances beyond their control, and who now found themselves abandoned in their time of greatest need. "My clients gave Dana nightlife," Kelso said, his voice rich with emotion. "They raised her for 8 years, provided for her as best they could during difficult financial times, and when circumstances forced difficult decisions, they did what they believed was best. Now, 30 years later, their daughter has become wealthy and famous beyond anything they could have imagined. She has $60 million, a mansion, fame, and influence. And yet, when her elderly parents reached out desperate and struggling with medical bills and the basic costs of living, she turned them away. She refuses to acknowledge them to help them to fulfill even the most basic filial duty that children owe to parents." He carefully avoided mentioning the abandonment directly, instead using euphemisms like difficult decisions and circumstances forced separation. He focused entirely on moral obligation and the idea that children owe their parents support, regardless of past conflicts. I sat perfectly still, my face calm despite the rage building inside me. David had coached me extensively on courtroom demeanor. Emotion could be misread as guilt or instability. Composure suggested confidence in the truth. When it was David's turn, he didn't waste time with emotional appeals or euphemisms. He went straight for the evidence. Your Honor, members of the jury, what you're about to see is security camera footage from the night of October 15th, over 20 years ago. I want to warn you that this footage is disturbing as it shows the deliberate abandonment of an 8-year-old child. The courtroom lights dimmed, and the footage played on a large screen. I'd seen it multiple times by now, but watching it in a silent courtroom filled with strangers made it feel different, more real, more devastating. I heard someone in the gallery gasp when my father threw the backpack onto the pavement. I saw several jurors' expressions shift from neutral to horrified as they watched my small figure crying in the back window. The audio of my desperate pleading and the family's laughter seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. When the footage showed my father burning documents, I heard murmuring throughout the gallery. The judge had to gently tap her gavel to restore silence. David let the footage speak for itself, then followed it immediately with the abandonment statement projected on the screen for everyone to read. The child would be better off elsewhere. We cannot provide for her needs. David read aloud, emphasizing each word. These are the plaintiff's own words written in his own hand, signed voluntarily. Not the words of parents desperately searching for their missing daughter, but the words of parents who deliberately chose to give their child away. I watched my biological father's face as his own handwriting was displayed for the entire courtroom to see. His jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists on the table, and I saw the anger he was barely containing. The judge leaned forward, studying the documents. Mr. Kelso, your client signed this statement acknowledging they were unwilling to care for the minor child and requesting state intervention. How do you reconcile this with your opening statement, suggesting they were separated through unfortunate circumstances? Kelso stood clearly prepared for this challenge. Your Honor, my clients were in desperate financial straits. They believed at that moment that they couldn't provide adequate care. It was a decision made under duress, not a permanent abandonment. Did they attempt to regain custody at any point? The judge interrupted. The circumstances were complicated, Your Honor. There were investigations, legal proceedings. That's not what I asked. Did they ever attempt to regain custody of their daughter? The silence that followed was damning. Kelso shifted uncomfortably. Not formally through the courts, no, but... Thank you, counsel. Continue, Mr. Chen. David called my biological father to the stand first, and I watched him walk to the witness box with careful, measured steps designed to make him look frailer than he was. But I'd seen him at my gate, seen the strength in his movements when he thought no one important was watching. Under David's cross-examination, the facade began to crumble almost immediately. My father claimed poverty had forced the abandonment, but when David produced tax records and utility bills from that year, they showed a maintained household with regular income. Mr. Knight, you testified that you were too poor to care for Dana, yet these records show you owned a car, maintained a home with electricity and water, and were employed full-time. Can you explain this discrepancy? We had bills, lots of bills. Did you have enough money to pay someone to stay quiet about what they witnessed? David asked, producing evidence of the payment to Mr. Langford. My father's face reddened. I don't know what you're talking about. You don't remember paying your neighbor $500 to keep quiet about the abuse he witnessed. That's not I didn't. He was flustered now, contradicting himself, his careful composure slipping. When David showed him the footage of burning documents, my father claimed he was just cleaning up trash, but he couldn't explain why he was doing it at a gas station late at night, or why the timestamp coincided exactly with the welfare fraud investigation. "Were you destroying evidence of fraud, Mr. Knight?" "No, I was just—" His voice rose, anger seeping through. "You're twisting everything, making it sound worse than it was. I'm simply asking you to explain your own actions captured on video," David said calmly. The anger I remembered from childhood was surfacing now, that barely controlled rage that had terrified me as a child. Several jurors leaned back slightly as if instinctively recognizing danger. The gentle, frail, elderly man from the opening statement was being replaced by someone harder, crueler, more volatile. Judge Morrison was taking notes, her expression growing increasingly skeptical. Just as David was preparing his next question, the judge's clerk approached the bench with a document. The judge read it, her eyebrows rising in surprise. "Counsel approach," she said. David and Kelso went to the bench for a hushed conference. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I saw David's expression shift to surprise, then something that looked like satisfaction. When they returned to their positions, Judge Morrison addressed the courtroom. "I've just received a request for witness testimony from someone who was present the night of the abandonment. This is unexpected, but given the significance of their potential testimony, I'm inclined to allow it. We'll recess for 30 minutes while arrangements are made." The gavel fell and the courtroom erupted into whispered speculation. Thomas leaned forward from the gallery. "Did you know about this?" "No," I said, my heart racing. "David, who is it?" He looked at the document in his hand, then at me, and I saw something in his expression I couldn't quite read. "It's Mr. Hawkins's grandson, Thomas's grandfather. Apparently there's something about that night he never told anyone." I looked at Thomas, confused. "Your grandfather passed away 5 years ago." Thomas's face had gone pale. "I know. This doesn't make sense." David was already on his phone speaking urgently with someone. When he returned to our table, he looked shaken. "I apologize, there was a miscommunication with my office. The witness isn't Mr. Hawkins Sr., it's apparently someone else who was there that night, someone we didn't know about. The clerk will bring me more information during the recess." The 30-minute break felt endless. David disappeared to review documents and speak with the surprise witness. Thomas and I sat in a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom, both of us anxious and confused about who could possibly be testifying. When David returned, he was carrying a folder and wearing an expression I'd never seen before, something between amazement and deep emotion. "Dana," he said carefully, sitting across from us, "do you remember Mr. Hawkins? The man who found you at the gas station?" "Of course, Thomas's grandfather. He called you and Margaret that night." "Yes, but what you didn't know, what I just learned, is that Mr. Hawkins kept detailed journals for most of his life. When he passed away, his belongings went to a nephew who only recently found the journals while clearing out storage. In them, Mr. Hawkins documented the night he found you, including details he apparently never shared with anyone, not even Thomas and Margaret." My heart was racing. "What kind of details?" "Details about an encounter he had with your father several days before the abandonment. The nephew contacted our office this morning, and I've had investigators verifying his identity and the authenticity of the journals all through lunch. He's here now, and he's brought the relevant journal entries. Judge Morrison has agreed to allow the testimony based on the documentation." When court reconvened, a man in his 60s entered through the side door. He had kind eyes and carried himself with quiet dignity. He was sworn in and took the witness stand, introducing himself as Robert Hawkins' nephew of the late Henry Hawkins, who'd found me that October night. David approached with the journal already entered into evidence during the recess. "Mr. Hawkins, can you explain what brought you here today?" "I was going through my uncle's belongings he passed 5 years ago and found boxes of journals he'd kept since he was a young man. He was meticulous about documenting his days. When I started reading the entries from late 1990s, I found descriptions of a night that I knew was significant. The night he found a little girl abandoned at the gas station he used to manage." David opened the journal to a marked page. "Can you read the entry from October 15th? Robert adjusted his reading glasses and began. His voice was steady but filled with emotion as he read his uncle's words. Tonight, I found a child abandoned at the station. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, shivering in the cold with a torn backpack. When I asked her how long she'd been alone, she said she didn't know, maybe an hour, maybe more. She told me her family had driven away and weren't coming back. She said, "They told me I cost too much. They said I'm the problem. No child should ever believe they're not worth loving. I called Tommy immediately. I knew he and Margaret would help." Tears were already streaming down my face. Hearing those words, my words from that night preserved in a stranger's journal for decades, made the memory more real than it had been in years. "Is there more?" David asked gently. "Yes. There's an earlier entry that my uncle never told anyone about. From October 12th, 3 days before he found Dana." David nodded and Robert turned back several pages. "This is what my uncle wrote, strange encounter today at the station. A man was using the payphone, agitated and angry. I only caught fragments of his conversation, but what I heard troubled me. He kept saying, 'Getting rid of the problem before the state finds out,' and 'one less kid on the paperwork.' He was angry, talking about investigators and audits. When he finished his call, he noticed me nearby and grew hostile, demanded to know if I was eavesdropping. I told him I was just checking the pumps. He got in his car and drove away fast, but I remembered his face." The courtroom was completely silent. David approached the witness stand. "Mr. Hawkins, did your uncle identify this man?" "Yes. In a later entry after he found Dana, he wrote, 'The man from the payphone, I'm certain now. It was the same man whose car left the station with one less passenger than it arrived with. The father who abandoned his daughter was the same man I heard talking about getting rid of the problem. This wasn't desperation or poverty. This was planned.'" David turned to face my biological father, whose face had gone from red to white. "Your Honor, this testimony establishes clear premeditation. The defendant was planning to abandon his daughter days in advance, specifically to avoid state investigation into welfare fraud." Kelso was on his feet immediately. "Objection. This is hearsay." "It's a recorded recollection, Your Honor," David countered. "Made contemporaneously by a witness with no stake in this case, now deceased. It falls under the exception to hearsay rules." Judge Morrison considered for a moment. "I'll allow it. The objection is overruled." Robert continued reading entries that detailed how his uncle had called the police anonymously after finding me, how he'd insisted they investigate the family for fraud, how he'd worried about me for weeks until he learned that Thomas and Margaret had successfully adopted me. The final entry, dated nearly a year after the abandonment, made me break down completely. "I saw the little girl from the station today at Tommy's house for Sunday dinner. She calls Margaret Mom now, and she was smiling. Really smiling, not the fake smile children make when they're scared. She looked healthy and safe and loved. I thought about telling her I was the one who found her that night, but decided against it. She's building a new life. She doesn't need to be reminded of the old one. I'm just grateful she survived. She deserved so much better than what those people gave her." Through my tears, I looked at the photo of Mr. Hawkins that Robert had brought, a kind-faced elderly man I barely remembered. He'd been there at the worst moment of my life, and then he'd stepped back, letting me heal without burdening me with gratitude or obligation. He'd simply been good because that's who he was. Robert stepped down from the witness stand but paused as he passed our table. He looked directly at me and said, echoing his uncle's words, "My uncle would be so proud of the woman you've become, Dana. You deserved so much better than what those people gave you." "Thank you," I managed to whisper, my voice breaking. "He saved my life." Several jurors were wiping their eyes. Even Judge Morrison appeared moved, though she maintained her professional composure. The courtroom had been utterly silent during the testimony, absorbed in the story of a man who'd witnessed evil and responded with quiet goodness. David let the emotional impact settle for a moment before addressing the judge. "Your Honor, the defense rests. We believe the evidence speaks clearly. But we should have known my biological father wouldn't accept defeat quietly. That evening, as we were leaving the courthouse, Kelso filed an emergency motion with new evidence. David's phone rang as we walked to our cars, and I watched his expression shift from exhaustion to disbelief. "They're claiming what?" he said into the phone. He listened for several minutes, his face growing darker. "That's insane. Even for them, that's—" "Yes, I'll review it tonight. We'll respond in the morning." He hung up and turned to me with barely controlled anger. "Your father has submitted new evidence claiming that the abandonment statement is fabricated and the security footage was doctored. He's saying we manufactured evidence to frame him." "Can he do that?" Thomas asked. "He can try." But his own lawyer looked sick presenting it according to my clerk, who was still in the courthouse. "Even Kelso knows this is desperate and probably fraudulent. We'll dismantle it tomorrow, but Dana, I want you prepared. This is going to get uglier before it gets better." Court reconvened the next morning with heightened tension. The gallery was even more packed than before, word having spread about the dramatic testimony from the previous day. David had spent all night with forensic experts, and he approached the bench with a thick folder and an expression of barely contained anger. Kelso presented the new evidence to the judge, but even as he spoke, I could see the discomfort in his posture. He was a lawyer doing his job, but he clearly knew what he was presenting was garbage. The document allegedly proving the abandonment statement was forged looked official at first glance, but David's expert witness, a forensic document examiner, took it apart systematically. The fonts were inconsistent with documents from that era. The date formatting didn't match government standards from the time period. Most damningly, the digital metadata showed the file had been created 4 days ago on a home computer registered to my biological father. "Your Honor," David said, his voice tight with controlled fury, "this isn't just new evidence. This is fabricated evidence. This is fraud perpetrated on this court, and it should be treated as such." Judge Morrison's expression was glacial as she examined the evidence. "Mr. Kelso, are you aware that submitting falsified documents to the court is a criminal offense?" Kelso stood, his face flushed. "Your Honor, my clients provided this documentation in good faith." "Good faith?" The judge's tone was sharp. "Mr. Kelso, even a cursory examination reveals this document was created this week, not 20 years ago. I'm going to ask you directly, did you review this evidence before submitting it?" The silence stretched out painfully. Finally, Kelso said quietly, "I was given the documents late last night, Your Honor. I expressed concerns about their authenticity to my clients, but they insisted." "That's enough. I want the plaintiffs on the stand. Now." My biological mother was called first, and I watched her walk to the witness stand with the shuffling gait of someone who'd given up fighting long ago. Under David's questioning, she deflected and evaded giving rehearsed answers that sounded hollow even to her. But then David changed tactics. Instead of asking about the fraudulent documents, he asked about me, about the night I was abandoned, about the years that followed. "Mrs. Knight, did you want to abandon your daughter that night?" Her hands twisted in her lap. "We didn't have a choice." "That's not what I asked. Did you want to leave her at that gas station?" My husband said, "What did you want?" Something broke in her then. Maybe it was the decades of submission. Maybe it was the weight of guilt she'd carried. Or maybe it was simply exhaustion. Whatever the reason, she started crying deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire frame. "I didn't want to," she finally whispered. "I didn't want any of it. But he controlled everything. He decided, and I was too afraid to say no." "Were you afraid of your husband?" David asked gently. "Yes, always. If I questioned him, if I disagreed, he would—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The fear in her voice painted the picture clearly. "Did you ever try to contact Dana after the abandonment?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "When she was 12, I found out where she was going to school. I drove there one day planning to see her, to talk to her, to apologize. But he found out. He followed me. He dragged me back to the car and—" Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. He made sure I never tried again. The courtroom was silent. I felt Thomas's hand on my shoulder from the row behind me, steadying me as I processed what I was hearing. My mother had tried. Once. And been punished for it. Did your husband plan the abandonment in advance? David asked. Yes, she said, her voice strengthening slightly with each admission. Days before. He was angry about the state investigation, said Dana was the problem, said we had to get rid of her before they found out about the benefits fraud. I begged him to find another way, but he said this was the only way. The admission hung in the air, premeditated, calculated, exactly what the evidence had suggested. My biological father had been growing more agitated with each word his wife spoke. Now he stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the floor. Shut up, he hissed at her. Just shut your mouth, mister. Knight, sit down, Judge Morrison ordered. But he was beyond listening. 20 years of lies were unraveling, and he couldn't contain his rage. She's lying. She's weak. She's always been weak, and now she's trying to make me the villain. Mr. Knight, I'm warning you. This whole thing is persecution, he shouted, his face red with fury. That girl caused nothing but problems from the day she was born. We did what we had to do, and now she's trying to destroy us because she got rich and forgot where she came from. Security officers were already moving toward him. He turned on them, still raging. You're all against me. My own wife, my daughter, this whole corrupt system. It took 3 security officers to remove him from the courtroom, his shouting echoing even after the doors closed. The jury sat in stunned silence, having witnessed exactly the kind of rage I'd lived with as a child. Every word he'd screamed had proven everything we'd been claiming: his violence, his blame, shifting, his complete inability to take responsibility. Judge Morrison's voice was cold when she finally spoke. This court will take a 30-minute recess. Mr. Kelso, I strongly suggest you have a conversation with your clients about the wisdom of continuing this lawsuit. I'm also placing a formal note in the record that I'm considering criminal referrals for fraud, perjury, and contempt of court. The gavel fell, and I felt something release in my chest. It was almost over. But as we stood to leave for the recess, Thomas's phone rang. I watched his face drain of color as he listened, then he grabbed my arm urgently. We need to go, he said, his voice shaking. That was the hospital. Margaret's taken a turn for the worse. They said we should come now. I wanted to leave immediately to rush to Margaret's bedside, but David grabbed my arm gently. Dana, the judge, is about to deliver her ruling. Margaret would want you to see this through. She fought so hard for you to get to this moment. He was right, and I knew it, but every second felt like an eternity. We returned to the courtroom, and I sat rigidly in my chair, divided between the need to be here for the conclusion and the desperate pull to be with Margaret. Judge Morrison took the bench, and the courtroom fell silent. Before she began her ruling, her clerk approached with an envelope. The judge opened it, read the contents, and her expression softened, in a way I hadn't seen throughout the entire trial. Before I deliver my verdict, she said, her voice measured, but carrying unexpected emotion. I've received a letter that was delivered to my chambers this morning. It's from Margaret Marshall, Dana Knight's adoptive mother, written several weeks ago when she could still write. Given its relevance to this case, I'm going to read it with the court's permission. I felt my breath catch. Thomas reached forward from his seat behind me and squeezed my shoulder. Judge Morrison cleared her throat and began reading. Your Honor. I have loved Dana as my daughter for 30 years. I chose her not out of obligation, but out of recognition. I saw in her eyes the same abandonment I once felt as a child, waiting at a train station for a mother who never returned. Her biological parents gave up the right to call her their daughter the night they drove away from a gas station and left her shivering in the dark, terrified and alone. They didn't search for her. They didn't fight for her. They signed papers asking the state to take her away. For 30 years they remained silent. No birthday cards, no phone calls, no attempts at contact. And now, when she has built a life from the ashes of what they destroyed, they appear demanding money and claiming parental rights they abandoned 3 decades ago. Your Honor, please don't let them take from her now. She has already lost too much. She deserves peace. She deserves to live without the shadow of people who saw her as a burden rather than a blessing. Whatever you decide, please know that Dana has always been loved, always been wanted, and always been worthy, no matter what those people tried to make her believe. With deepest respect, Margaret Eleanor Marshall. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. I saw jurors wiping tears. Even the court reporter had paused, visibly moved. My own tears were flowing freely now, and I didn't bother to hide them. Margaret had fought for me one last time, even from a hospital bed, even when writing must have taken strength she could barely spare. Judge Morrison set the letter down, carefully took a moment to compose herself, then looked directly at my biological parents. I have presided over many difficult cases in my career. She began, her voice firm and clear. But rarely have I seen such a stark contrast between documented evidence and claimed narrative. The plaintiffs would have this court believe they are loving parents cruelly abandoned by an ungrateful daughter. The evidence tells an entirely different story. She methodically went through the findings, the security footage showing deliberate abandonment, the signed statement requesting state intervention, the welfare fraud investigation, the fabricated evidence submitted just yesterday, and the violent outburst that had required security intervention. The plaintiffs voluntarily abandoned their 8-year-old daughter, Judge Morrison continued. They signed documents acknowledging they were unwilling to care for her. They made no attempts to maintain contact for 30 years. They only reappeared after the defendant became wealthy and famous. This is not a case of estranged family members seeking reconciliation. This is a calculated attempt to extract money from someone who was victimized as a child and is being victimized again as an adult. She turned her attention to the legal claims. The plaintiffs argue that the defendant has a filial obligation to support them. However, filial responsibility requires an established parent-child relationship. The plaintiffs severed that relationship permanently when they abandoned their daughter and allowed another family to adopt her. They have no legal or moral claim to the defendant's support or assets. The ruling came swift and decisive. The lawsuit was dismissed in its entirety. My biological parents were ordered to pay my legal fees, which David had already warned me would exceed $200,000. The judge also made formal referrals to the district attorney for investigation into welfare fraud, perjury, and submitting false evidence to the court. Mr. Knight, the judge said, looking at my biological father who'd been brought back into the courtroom in restraints after his earlier outburst. You will be facing serious criminal charges. I suggest you secure competent legal counsel. She turned to my mother and her expression softened slightly. Mrs. Knight, your testimony today revealed that you have also been a victim in this situation. If you cooperate with authorities and separate yourself from your husband's criminal activities, the district attorney may show leniency. I encourage you to seek help and protection. My mother nodded numbly, looking smaller and more broken than I'd ever seen her. The judge's final words were directed at me. Ms. Knight, this court recognizes the trauma you endured as a child and the courage you've shown in defending yourself against those who should have protected you. You owe these people nothing. You are free to live your life without their interference. This court's ruling is final. The gavel fell, and it was over. My biological father began cursing immediately, struggling against the security officers holding him. This is bullshit! You can't do this. I'm her father. I have rights. But he had no rights. Not anymore. Not ever again. My mother sat motionless, staring at her hands, and I wondered if she was finally, after decades of fear and submission, experiencing something like relief. My sister, who'd been sitting in the gallery, stood and left without looking at anyone, her face blank and unreadable. People crowded around me, supporters, reporters, strangers who wanted to tell me they believed me, that they were proud of me. But all I could think about was Margaret lying in a hospital bed, having spent her final reserves of strength fighting for me one last time. Thomas and I pushed through the crowd and practically ran to his car. David called after us that he'd handle all the post-trial procedures, that we should go, that Margaret was more important than paperwork. The drive to the hospital was a blur. Thomas drove faster than I'd ever seen him drive, both of us silent, except for my occasional whispered prayers that we wouldn't be too late. When we finally pulled into the hospital parking lot, Thomas's phone rang again. He answered, listened for a moment, and his hand tightened on the steering wheel. When he hung up, he turned to me with tears in his eyes. "She's awake," he said, his voice breaking with relief and sorrow mixed together. "She's asking for you. But Dana, they said we need to hurry." We ran through the hospital corridors past startled nurses and visitors until we reached Margaret's room. The machines around her bed beeped steadily but weakly, and she looked impossibly fragile against the white sheets. But her eyes were open, and when she saw me, she smiled. I reached Margaret's bedside and took her hand, gently mindful of the IV line and the fragility of her fingers. Her skin was cool and papery thin, but when she squeezed my hand, I felt the same strength that had carried me through 30 years of life. "Did you win?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the beeping monitors. "Yes," I said, tears already streaming down my face. "We won. It's over." Her face transformed with a smile so beautiful it broke my heart. "Good. You deserved that. You deserved justice and peace, and the chance to finally close that chapter." She paused, catching her breath, and I could see how much effort even speaking required. "Tell me everything." So I did. I told her about the judge reading her letter aloud, about how the entire courtroom had been moved to tears about the ruling that dismissed the lawsuit and ordered my biological parents to pay my legal fees. I told her about my father's rage and removal from the courtroom, about my mother's confession, about the criminal referrals the judge had made. Margaret listened with her eyes closed, but I could see the satisfaction in her expression. When I finished, she opened her eyes and looked at me with such love and pride that I had to look away for a moment to compose myself. "I meant every word of that letter," she said softly. "You are my daughter. You always were, from the moment I saw you shivering at that gas station. Not because of paperwork or legal proceedings, but because I chose you, and you chose me back. That's what makes a family, Dana. Not blood, not obligation, choice and love. You saved my life," I said through my tears. "I don't know who I would have become without you and Thomas. I don't know if I would have survived." "You would have survived," Margaret said with certainty. "Because you're a survivor, Dana. That strength was in you long before I came along. But I'm grateful I got to see you flourish, to watch you transform from a frightened little girl into the remarkable woman you became." She paused, struggling for breath, and I wanted to tell her to rest to save her strength, but I also knew we were running out of time for words that needed to be said. "You gave me just as much as I gave you," Margaret continued. "Maybe more. You gave me purpose. After I aged out of foster care, after I spent years feeling like I didn't matter to anyone, you gave me the chance to be the mother I wish I'd had. You gave me the opportunity to break the cycle, to choose love instead of abandonment, to prove that being wanted is more powerful than any biological connection." "I was so lucky to find you," I whispered. "We found each other," she corrected gently. "That gas station that night, it wasn't random, Dana. I believe we were meant to find each other. You needed a mother who understood abandonment, and I needed a daughter who would let me prove that love can heal what cruelty breaks." We sat in silence for a while, just holding hands, and I let myself remember. The first night in her home, when she'd read me stories until I fell asleep because she knew I was afraid of the dark. The morning she'd found my hidden food stash, and instead of being angry, she'd simply held me and promised I'd never go hungry. The countless school events where she'd been the loudest one cheering. The day she and Thomas had finalized my adoption, and she'd cried happy tears while telling me I was officially, legally, permanently theirs. "Do you remember teaching me to make cookies?" I asked, smiling through my tears. That first Christmas when I spilled flour everywhere? Margaret's laugh was weak, but genuine. You got more flour on yourself than in the bowl. And when Thomas came home, we both looked like we'd been in a snowstorm. He took one look at us and just started laughing. You never got angry when I made mistakes, I said. You were always patient, always kind, always there. Because you deserved patience and kindness, Margaret said simply. Every child does. I just wish more children had someone to show them that. Her breathing was becoming more labored, and I could see her struggling to stay present to hold on to consciousness. Thomas entered the room quietly and came to stand on the other side of the bed, taking Margaret's other hand. Both my girls, Margaret whispered, looking between Thomas and me with confusion. No, wait. Thomas is my... Her words trailed off, and I realized the medication and failing oxygen were affecting her clarity. I'm here, sweetheart, Thomas said gently. Dana's here too. We're both here. Margaret's eyes focused on me again, and for a moment they cleared with purpose and urgency. Promise me something, she said, her grip on my hand tightening with surprising strength. Anything, I said. You tell your story, Dana, all of it. The abandonment, the adoption, the lawsuit, everything. You help other children who feel the way you once did, worthless and unwanted, and convinced they're the problem. You show them that survival is possible, that healing is possible, that they deserve love, even when the people who should love them fail. Promise me you'll use your voice to help them. The weight of that request settled over me, but it didn't feel heavy. It felt right, like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. Everything I'd survived, everything I'd overcome, everything I'd built, it could all mean something beyond my personal success. It could help children who were standing where I once stood alone and abandoned and trying to understand why they weren't worth keeping. I promise, I said, my voice firm despite my tears. I promise I'll tell the truth and help others who need to hear it. Margaret smiled, and I saw peace wash over her features. That's my girl, she whispered. So proud of you. So grateful I got to be your mother. Her eyes closed then, and her breathing shifted to something shallower, more distant. Thomas and I looked at each other across her bed, and I saw my own grief reflected in his face. We'd known this was coming, had been preparing for it in the abstract way you prepare for inevitable loss, but nothing could have truly prepared us for the reality of watching her slip away. I stayed beside her, holding her hand, talking to her, even as I wasn't sure she could hear me anymore. I told her about my plans for the show, about advocacy work I wanted to do, about the foundation I was thinking of starting in her name. I told her about memories she'd given me, about the difference she'd made, about the love that would outlive her physical presence. When her breathing finally stopped, when the monitors emitted their final heartbreaking tones, I didn't let go of her hand. Thomas and I sat there together in the sudden silence, both of us crying, both of us holding on to the woman who had chosen love when the world had shown her abandonment, who had given everything to ensure that one frightened little girl would grow up knowing she was wanted. The nurses gave us time before they came in. Time to grieve, time to say final goodbyes, time to transition from a world where Margaret existed to one where she lived only in memory and impact. A week later, we held her funeral. The church was packed with people whose lives she'd touched, former foster children she'd mentored, families she'd helped through adoption processes, friends and neighbors who'd witnessed her quiet goodness over decades. I delivered the eulogy, though I could barely see the pages through my tears, talking about the woman who'd taught me that family was a choice, and that love was stronger than biology. The grief was overwhelming, but it was also clarifying. Margaret's death felt like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. She'd given me the tools to survive, the love to heal, and now with her final request, the purpose to help others. 3 days after the funeral, my agent called with news that felt both surreal and somehow inevitable. A major film studio wanted to buy the rights to my life story. They wanted to create a documentary about abandonment survival and the meaning of family. I thought about Margaret's final words, "You tell your story, Dana," and I knew exactly what my answer would be. I crossed the room in 3 steps and took Margaret's hand, careful of the IV lines and monitors. Her skin was cool and paper-thin, but her grip was surprisingly firm when she squeezed my fingers. "Did you win?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes," I said, tears already streaming down my face. "We won. Everything." The judge dismissed their lawsuit, ordered them to pay our legal fees, and referred my father for criminal prosecution. Margaret's face lit up with a smile that seemed to take all her remaining strength. "Good. You deserved that. You deserved justice." "Your letter," I said, my voice breaking. "Margaret, your letter to the judge, it was perfect. It was exactly what I needed everyone to hear." "I meant every word," she said softly, each breath an effort. "You are my daughter, Dana. You always were from the moment I saw you at that gas station. Biology doesn't make family. Choice does. Love does." I laid my head gently on her shoulder the way I had countless times over 30 years, and felt her hand stroke my hair with weakening movements. Thomas stood at the foot of the bed, his own tears falling silently as he watched the 2 most important women in his life say goodbye. "Thank you," I whispered, "for choosing me, for fighting for me, for loving me when I believed I was unlovable. You saved my life, Margaret. In every way that matters, you saved my life." "You gave me just as much," Margaret said, her breathing growing more labored. "You gave me purpose. You gave me the chance to be the mother I wish I'd had when I was 9 years old and alone at that train station. You let me rewrite my own story by being part of yours." We talked about memories, though Margaret's words came slower and quieter with each passing minute. She smiled when I reminded her of the first day she brought me home, how I'd hidden food in my dresser drawer and flinched at every sudden movement. She laughed weakly at the memory of teaching me to bake cookies and how we'd both ended up covered in flour. She cried when I told her about my college graduation, how seeing her and Thomas in the audience was the moment I truly understood what unconditional love looked like. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "Everything you've become, everything you've overcome, I'm so proud to call you my daughter." "I wouldn't be here without you," I said. "None of this, the career, the success, the strength to face them in court, none of it would exist if you hadn't chosen to love me." Margaret's eyes were starting to close, exhaustion and medication pulling her toward sleep. But she fought to stay present a moment longer, gripping my hand with what remained of her strength. "Promise me something," she whispered. "Anything. Tell your story. Really tell it. Help other children who feel the way you once did. Show them that survival is possible, that healing is possible, that they're worth loving even when someone made them believe otherwise. Your pain has purpose now. Use it." "I promise," I sobbed. "I promise, Margaret." She smiled one last time, a peaceful expression settling over her features. "Good. That's my girl. I love you, Dana. I always will." "I love you too," I whispered, but her eyes had already closed. Her breathing grew shallower, each breath farther apart than the last. Thomas moved to the other side of the bed and took her other hand, and together we sat with her as the monitors began to slow, as the woman who had saved us both slipped quietly away. When the steady beep became a single tone, when the nurse came in and gently confirmed what we already knew, I stayed beside her, holding her hand, and remembering every kindness, every sacrifice, every moment of love she'd given me over 30 years. Thomas and I sat together in that hospital room for hours, neither of us ready to leave, neither of us ready to face a world without Margaret in it. We cried together, we shared stories, and we held on to each other the way Margaret had always held on to us, with fierce, unconditional love. The funeral a week later was attended by hundreds of people whose lives Margaret had touched. But for me, the real goodbye had happened in that hospital room with her hand in mine and her final words echoing in my heart. A week after we buried her, my agent called with news I wasn't expecting. "Dana, I've been contacted by a major film studio. They want to buy the rights to your life story. They're talking about a full documentary prime-time release, significant budget. They want to tell your story properly. I sat in the house I'd bought Thomas after Margaret passed, looking at photos of the three of us over the years, and I heard Margaret's voice in my head. Tell your story. Help other children who feel the way you once did. Set up the meeting, I told my agent. But I have conditions. The documentary deal came with the conditions I'd demanded: creative control, honest storytelling, and a commitment that the Marshalls would be honored as the heroes they truly were. The film aired 6 months after Margaret's death, and the response was overwhelming. Millions of viewers watched, and the conversation it sparked about child abandonment, adoption, and the true meaning of family reached further than I'd ever imagined. With the proceeds and my own resources, I established the Margaret Marshall Foundation, dedicated to helping abandoned and neglected children find safe, loving homes. The work became my purpose, transforming the pain of my past into something that could help others survive theirs. 3 months after the foundation launched, I received another message from my sister. This time, I was prepared. I agreed to meet her, but on my terms, in the foundation's office during business hours with my assistant in the next room. She looked worse than she had at the park. Thinner, more fragile, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and deep trauma. She sat across from me, hands shaking, and immediately began confessing everything. I recorded you that day, she said, tears already streaming down her face. Dad told me exactly what to say, what questions to ask, where to steer the conversation. And I did it because I was terrified not to. Terrified of what? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Of him, of what he'd do if I refused. She took a shaky breath. Dana, I know you don't remember much about me. You left when I was so young. But after you were gone, I became his target. The things he did. Her voice broke completely. I can't even say it out loud yet. I'm in therapy trying to work through it, but some days I can barely function. My heart broke for her, this stranger who was also my sister, this woman who'd been trapped in the hell I'd escaped. He abused you, I said gently. She nodded, unable to speak. And when he told you to help with the lawsuit, to record me, to participate in the lies, you were too afraid to say no. I know that's not an excuse, she whispered. I know I hurt you, and I'm so sorry. But Dana, I need you to understand, I wasn't trying to destroy you. I was trying to survive. I believed her. I could see the truth in her pain, recognize the fear that had once consumed my own childhood. But I also knew that compassion and boundaries weren't mutually exclusive. I forgive you, I said, and watched relief flood her face. But I can't have you in my life right now. You need to heal, to get completely away from him, to build your own strength and independence. When you're ready, when you've done that work, maybe we can try again. But not now. The relief on her face shifted to something that looked like understanding. That's fair, she said quietly. The foundation has resources, I continued. Therapists who specialize in childhood trauma, support groups, legal aid if you need help getting a restraining order. I'll make sure you have access to everything, but you have to do the work. You have to choose to heal. I will, she promised. Before she left, she reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. Mom wanted you to have this. She gave it to me a few weeks before the trial, before everything exploded. She said if anything happened to her, I should make sure you got it. Inside was a photograph I'd never seen before, me as a small child, maybe 5 years old, smiling at the camera. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough. You deserved the world. I stared at it for a long time, feeling emotions I couldn't quite name. My mother had kept this photo for decades, hidden from my father, a small rebellion against the narrative that I was worthless. It didn't excuse her silence or her complicity, but it proved that somewhere buried under layers of fear and abuse, there had been a woman who'd loved her daughter but lacked the courage to protect her. It was the closest to closure I would ever get with her, and somehow it was enough. 6 months later, I stood at the opening ceremony of the Foundation's first residential center for abandoned children. The building, beautiful and warm, and designed to feel like a home rather than an institution, bore a bronze plaque, the Margaret and Thomas Marshall House. I spoke to the crowd about resilience and second chances, about how family is defined by love rather than biology, about how survival is possible even when it feels impossible. And after the speeches ended and the crowd dispersed, a young girl approached me shyly, her eyes holding the same fear and hope I'd once felt. "I saw your documentary," she whispered. "It made me feel less alone." I knelt down to her level, looked into her eyes and said, "You are never alone, and you are worth everything." In that moment, I understood that my journey had truly come full circle. I'd gone from being the abandoned child to being the voice that child had needed. That evening back at my apartment, I found a letter that had been forwarded by David. It was from a woman named Rachel who claimed to know about another child my father had abandoned years before I was born. The letter ended, "Your father destroyed more lives than you know. I think it's time the world knew the whole truth." I held the letter in my hands, thinking about Margaret's final words about the Foundation, about all the children still waiting to be saved. Some stories, it seemed, were never truly finished. They just found new chapters. Standing in front of the Foundation that bore Margaret's name, holding a letter that promised to reveal even more of my father's cruelty, I realized something profound. My story wasn't just about surviving abandonment or winning in court. It was about breaking cycles, speaking truth, and showing others that healing is possible even when the wounds run deep. The little girl who was left shivering at a gas station, who believed she cost too much to be worth loving, had become a woman who could offer safety to children still trapped in that same darkness. Margaret had been right all along. My pain had purpose, but only because I chose to transform it into something that could help others. My biological father is currently serving time for welfare fraud and perjury. My mother lives quietly in a supervised facility, finally free from his control, but still carrying the weight of her choices. My sister is in therapy, slowly building a life separate from the trauma that shaped her. And me, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, using my platform, my resources, and my story to make sure no child ever has to wonder if they're worth saving. Some people are born into families. Others have to find them. I was lucky enough to be found by people who taught me that love isn't about biology, it's about choice, commitment, and showing up even when it's hard. The letter from Rachel still sits on my desk unopened. Some truths can wait. Right now, I have children to help, stories to tell, and a legacy to honor. Margaret always said I'd know when the time was right to tell the next chapter. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next year. But for today, I'm finally truly free, and that's worth everything.